a certain epoch in the culture of the ancient Arakacians and the present day, and who, apparently as a sort of protest against some state of affairs or another, seldom had his hair cut, who gave as his reason for joining the Democratic or State Party that people were thankful enough today if anybody joined them. It was this that made him uneasy, to have to take seriously things that weren't worth taking seriously. He was working himself into a state of mind which made him feel that, despite all his self-control, in having to defend the one responsible attitude with the pride of the single combatant, he might have to discard the shield of his personal dignity. When Ive came in with Paragot, he did not at first notice Broderman. Following the practice of latecomers to these gatherings, he tiptoed across the room, without greeting anyone, to find himself a chair, so as not to disturb the discussion. Broderman had half risen, and Schaffer gave him a friendly nod without interrupting what he was saying. Ive now saw Broderman face to face. He hesitated for a moment, nodded to him almost imperceptibly, turned very red, and sat down exactly opposite him. Schaffer threw an astonished glance at Ivan Broderman and went on with what he was saying. That, I don't know. At any rate, it was a mistake to regard the attitude of France, incomprehensible to German intelligence, in regard to the Hoover proposals simply as reactionary stubbornness or as dictated merely by hatred of Germany. Nor was it necessary to explain the French theses with benevolent objectivity as psychological, as the result probably of the formal, juristical trend of the French mind, or of the desire for security, arising out of the memory of the devastations of the war in the eastern departments. Ive thought to himself, Schaffer is surprised that Broderman and I are not falling on each other's necks as old war comrades. Old war comrades. If we had anything in common in the war, it was that each of us, uninfluenced by any group egoism, had to find his way and his attitude absolutely alone. For the French struggle for hegemony, which had its counterpart in an at least equally strong and equally natural German struggle for hegemony, was derived from too deep a source to be explained psychologically, and to be attributed merely to the political circumstances and the political position. In any case, it was not a question of a political, but of a historical direction of will, which attracts statecraft, whatever views statesmen may represent, into line with itself. Fundamentally, from the very first awakening of German consciousness, the destiny of Germany, and beyond that the destiny of Europe, depended on a single and immutable factor. This was the existence of the Reich, not, of course, just one of the perpetually changing political manifestations in the midst of Central Europe, but the complete content of thoughts and feelings, of dreams and tendencies which are contained in the concept, the Reich. Every German attempt to realize the concept must of necessity call into the battlefield all the powers who are in their essence non-German. Thus it was not surprising that the Reformation in its characteristic political significance, which was expressed at its finest in Luther's hymns, had been far more instrumental in bringing about a movement like the Counter-Reformation than humanism, which, as the revolt of an intellectual force, was certainly equally dangerous to the Church. Long after its first historical reaction, if not in any palpable achievement or in any conscious action, certainly in its influence, the Counter-Reformation undoubtedly had, and must have even today, a widely operative effect. As he said this, Schaffer looked across at Paragot, who appeared to agree with him. Now, the first manifest French attempt of the same character even led to the endeavor of King Francis I to have himself elected as Emperor of Germany, whilst his antagonist Charles V, who, owing to the far-sighted dynastic policy of his grandfather Maximilian, was also heir to the Spanish throne, was forced, in spite of Turkish wars and Italian decadence, again and again to dig his claws into France, if we could not renounce the pleasure of giving the picture a psychological justification. What had to be said was that obviously the French conception of history was unlike the German. For France, the individual epochs of history could be regarded as isolated, self-sufficient manifestations. As historical phenomena, they could be used as interesting, but objective examples for comparison, and then be laid away among the documents and archives made up of typical examples. Much could be learned by studying Plato and Aristotle, Erasmus and Voltaire, the life of Jeanne d'Arc, or even Napoleon. But for the French, there was no application which could serve as a lesson for the present day to be drawn from such a study. Whereas for us Germans, history was not a single process progressing in stages, but to a certain extent the continual crystallization and solution of one and the same element. And we could still hear today the deep, challenging voice of Plato. Meister Eckhart was still thinking today the thoughts that we have perpetually forgotten to think. And with us and today, the battle was repeatedly being waged, which has been waged from the Hohenstaufen to Bismarck. And every single epoch was a perpetual warning and injunction to fulfill today what has always been desired. It was just this lack of restrained mystic consciousness in the French mind which gave to French politics its amazingly more flexible character. Whereas with us, every association led to an eventually disastrous but holy alliance, or, the French, every alliance from the time of Louis XI to Napoleon and beyond that to the Great War, was always a fine and useful, but extremely unholy transaction. But this flexibility gave French politics not only the appearance of, but actual honorableness. What the French wanted, they wanted actually, whereas we were forced by historical retrospection always to be wanting something different from that for which we had entered the battle arena, so carefully prepared and manned. The result was that we always seemed to the world to be the most reactionary, and at the same time the most revolutionary nation, for whom it was a necessity to hold itself in readiness for every surprise. With this was closely associated the impossibility of understanding the character of Germany's struggle for power. If we were, as Dostoevsky described us, a Protestant power, our protest had always been for the sake of the Reich, and at the moment when we were very near to bringing the Reich to complete fulfillment, we produced protest and anger in all our neighbors. Above all, in the French. Thus, the conception of the Reich had a far-reaching effect, and whenever it struck root in great individual personalities, there was always a strong endeavor to tear them up from German soil, and give them an honorable, but universally palatable, super-national's intellectual origin. And there might even be said to be an effort on our part to drive back to their own sphere any personalities who were in some degree unpleasing, who had in all honor acted against this honor, regarding them with sure instinct as forces antagonistic to the Reich. Take, for example, Charles the Great, whom over there they describe, quite as a matter of course, as a Frenchman. In fact, in every incident of German history, which, as history, represented the perpetual struggle for the Reich, the world had re-echoed with the accusations hurled by the Germans against the French, and by the French against the Germans. Varied as these complaints had been, there was always a germ of similarity to be observed. The complaint had always been that the other was striving for hegemony in Europe. And, actually, if we asked ourselves who had the right to this hegemony, then there were abundant reasons for and against. But one thing was certain, that it could only belong to one of the two peoples, one of the two nations, and that the nation to whom it did not belong could no longer exist as a nation. That is, as a people with an historical task to fulfill. And however much the odds changed in the game of chance, the winner had always made conditions which were calculated to cut the sinews of the aggressor of the Reich. France knew how great the danger was, and so, at the present time, it had had to do something it had never done before, except in the Edict of Nantes. something which was even contrary to the essence of the French method, since it limited its flexibility. That is, to press through a treaty with the avowed intention of its being permanent and unalterable. Over and above this, arising out of it nonetheless, France had organized half the world, and if this had been accomplished in the neutral form of the League of Nations. After all, the League of Nations arose out of the treaty, and though possibly all the Geneva Theses of peace and justice had been listened to, read and promulgated by all the nations represented with an enigmatic smile, not so by France, since for her peace was the guarantee of her hegemony, and for her justice really was a slogan uttered from the heart, the highest political virtue to which it applied itself, since everything that France did must, how pleasant, be justice, so long as it served the ends of peace. But we saw what it actually meant to us. We saw in the League of Nations a counter-Reich. As he said this, Schaffer looked at Ive, for it was from a discussion with Ive that he had gleaned the idea. But Ive said nothing. He did not even look at Schaffer. His close-set eyes were fixed on the top buttons of Brodermann's uniform coat. Brodermann, too, said nothing, but he listened with an intent expression on his face. The discussion now took a more lively turn, with interesting disclosures about the Sino-Japanese conflict and the extraordinary attitude of France, which was not fully understood by the other powers, nor by the French people. And actually it was a question of interests in southern China, which only affected a small circle of capitalists, and of the distribution of spheres of interest, which had its explanation in Indo-Chinese affairs. But still neither Ive nor Brodermann took any part in what was being said. Later on, it is true, each one of them in turn ventured on a short remark. This was when Schaffer spoke of the part played by the citizen class, the bourgeoisie, in the form which had crystallized out of its political supremacy, making various attempts to define the word citizen and eventually giving a far-fetched explanation of the supremacy of this class as a manifestation of the idea of the counter-Reich toll. Then Brodermann asked politely, and obviously embarrassed, if, after all, it was not the French Revolution which had created a concept indispensable to the organization of every state, and which he had been waiting in vain to hear mentioned here, the concept of a citizen of the state, since Schaffer did not at once realize whether his leg was being pulled, or whether this was a serious criticism, and if so, from what angle it was being leveled. He let the observation pass with a few amiable words. Then Dr. Salamander broke in. He had returned from Paris since the banks had been closed by an emergency regulation, and he gave the impression of a man who no longer understood the world. But in the name of God, he asked, what would become of German intellectualism if the Third Reich was established? Is it conceivable that the intellectual freedom so laboriously won should be suppressed, gagged, and forced to go abroad, into exile, an immeasurable loss to German culture? Then I've said that he could not, of course, tell how the power of the Third Reich would be exercised. But when he reflected that, for at least 12 years, intellectual freedom had been able to put forth what blossoms it liked and had taken full advantage of this and out, indeed, had at its disposal a magnificent apparatus which it would be difficult to equal, and that it had made the greatest imaginable use of this apparatus, with the result that those very powers were now menacing it, which the approved representatives of intellect were steadily endeavoring, with all the weapons of reason, to scare back into their dark lairs. Then it is easy to imagine, Dr. Wally Salamander, what will happen to you and those on whose behalf you have raised your voice, namely, Nothing. Nothing will happen to them. They can go on writing calmly and confidently and peacefully. Nobody will read a word of it. I.Z. Schaffer disapproved of this turn in the discussion, and shaking his head playfully, he tactfully led the discussion, which was threatening to go to pieces, into the right lines again. Everything we have been saying, he went on, leads to the conclusion that what any German policy needs is an objective point which is a fundamental part of it. What we have to criticize in the present conditions, from whatever point of view we regard them, is their lack of any sort of objective point which would permit of far-sighted action. It is impossible to feel any certainty as to where things are leading. The reason for this impossibility lies in the system. So, Lieutenant Broderman wheeled round like a hawk, but he said nothing. Have I got to spend the whole evening gassing away by myself? Thought Schaffer. I must say something to rouse that blockhead. For, he continued, by reason of its origin and character, the system has no need to do anything but apply the national technique of political theory. That is to say, it is forced always to do exactly what other political powers prescribe. Once it has assumed hegemony, it cannot conceal by camouflage what it actually is, the tool of powers which have extra-national interests. Whatever policy the system undertakes to follow, it can never be what it professes to be, a national policy. Gentlemen, said Broderman, clearing his throat and fingering the air as though he were clasping the hilt of an invisible sword, and although he was annoyed with Dr. Schaffer, it was apparent to everyone that it could not be out of courtesy to his host that he addressed his words directly and exclusively to I. Gentlemen, said Broderman, you speak of the system. It is very much the fashion lately to speak of the system. After all, it is a very simple and convenient concept. But I know what the reason is. Whether I am too stupid, or whether it has to do with the state of public enlightenment. I have tried seriously, but so far I have not been able to understand what you really mean by the word system. What this system you talk about actually is. I might very well imagine what it is by putting together all that I have heard and read for and against the system. But there is nothing here to throw any light on the system. It simply does not exist. If one is to believe all the things that are said and written about it, it would appear to be something which has only a negative existence, that cannot therefore be described as to its qualities, and, although I am far from wishing to assume that it merely lives the ghostly life of the figment of a discontented imagination, you must permit me to fill the gap, which is visible in spite of all the many points of view which have been put forward, by adding my modest contribution to the discussion and telling you what might after all be claimed to be the system, even if it is not quite what you wish or are able to convey. And you must also permit me to refer to this straight away as the system, in order to avoid circumlocutions which detract from the necessary clarity. Oh, I see. Well then, the system means something that no movement or idea has to its credit, however great in itself, and however imposing a popular success it can claim. In short, an achievement. Moreover, it means an achievement which, according to all I have heard from you here, should be very acceptable to you, and should call for your applause, namely, the preservation of the right. That may surprise you, and possibly you have never heard of it before. But real achievement has a quality which cannot be strange to you, who after all belong to many different professions, without it having been evident in the discussion, namely, the quality of anonymity. You know that Graf Schlieffen, the man who transformed Moltke's heritage, the Prusso, German General Staff, into an instrument of military efficiency such as the world had never seen before, gave his officers a rule of personal conduct. Be rather than appear, and wherever it is a question of accomplishing real, essential work, detailed work, without which no task with a long end in view is possible, this principle must be observed. It is a Prussian principle, and it is a universal German principle, as soon as we consider the meaning of the state. Now this principle still applies today, or applies again, and it applies where you, and with you all those who know so well how to keep the German public occupied with their claims and problems, would never suspect it to apply. In the system, which does not stand in the public eye at all, and by reason of its sphere of activity, cannot stand in the public eye. I said that the system was an achievement, an anonymous achievement. Maybe, but it is a visible achievement to which you gentlemen, who are gathered here for profitable discussions, are immensely indebted, and in which, whether you wish it or not, in a great many of your activities, whether they be of a private or public nature, you operate. I do not mean, of course, lest you should misunderstand me, that you are indebted to it because it enables you to organize a protest against the system, although that has become a profitable occupation. What I mean is that it is only by the preservation of the Reich, even if you do not approve of the form it takes, that you are enabled to meet here for this animated discussion and, in spite of your different callings, unanimously to declare that everything must be changed. I tell you the system has preserved the Reich, and without the system it would be today the plaything of foreign powers, a heap of colored bricks, from which every political passer-by can take whatever he considers to be his share, but not a building as it actually is today. It is true, it is a faulty building with a leaking roof, and whose stairways and rooms are far too cramped, but in which nonetheless you can live, have a home, and which, if you want it, can give you an answer to the question of where you belong, as is natural. Where people are one on top of another, you can become involved in disputes, fly at one another's throats, in word or action. But if you attempt to knock down the walls of the house itself, your excuse that it had become too cramped for you will not prevent anyone from thinking that you have committed a crime. And surely it is for this contingency that the police exist. For the important thing, which comes before all private interests, is that we should preserve the little that has been left to us, and that from this foundation we should slowly win back, by hard and assiduous labor, what we have lost. And for this purpose it is no use bemoaning a happy past, however near or remote it may be. It is no use indulging in dreams of a glorious future. The one and only thing that is of any use is to realize what has to be done now, immediately, and in this way to provide a precisely calculated basis for what will have to be done in the future. I beg you, gentlemen, do not regard the men whom you consider representative of the system as idiots. Do not regard them as self-seekers or party fanatics. Do not weaken your own position by an error. And try not to excogitate a thraldom which has no connection with the real issue. In that way, you will only be fathering a thraldom whose character, when it is too late, will mightily astonish you, and will make you asseverate on your oath that you have no affection and no responsibility for the child. You can imagine that, having served as an officer of the old Imperial Prussian Army, I did not lightly decide to serve the Republic, especially when it bore a very different aspect from what it has become today, that I entered on my duties in a dispassionate and critical frame of mind, and the feeling I had for the men who had taken over the state government could only be described as one of complete mistrust. What could have led me to take this step but the certainty that it was essential, that all energies should be directed to the performance of the duties which were urgently demanding fulfillment on every side. And I can tell you, gentlemen, if there are any men whom I salute and to whom I say, all honor to you, they are the men who have saved the Reich by their unflinching attitude, and who have displayed a statesmanship with which I myself would never have credited them. Let me tell you, you may search far and wide through Germany before you will find a statesman who unites such qualities as Otto Braun. And if I may venture to the sphere of analogies, in which you are so much at home, then all I can say is that the wonderful relationship on which the foundations of the unity of the Reich were built, the relationship between Emperor William I and his Chancellor Bismarck, has its analogy today between the President of the Reich and Chancellor Brüning. Naturally, I cannot fall into the error of thinking that everything that exists today is good and wonderful and beautiful. No one can do that, particularly not anyone in a position of responsibility. The important point is not to hand out praise or to paint things black, but to recognize the position for what it is, to consider how it arose, and what possibilities for the future it affords. Surely it was not mere chance that out of the struggle between the opposing powers of right and left, of west and east, of north and south, of high and low, was developed the Reich in its present form, the system. And if you are searching for a mystic power, I can tell you where to find one. You will find it where, out of the unspeakable chaos of endeavors and trends, of opinions and facts, of regulations and emancipations, of clatter of guns and signing of treaties, of hunger and oppression, and hopes and fears, the Reich re-fashioned itself, the Reich that could contain and accomplish all this without falling asunder, and in which today a further step could be taken to consolidate its form and to strengthen its position in foreign politics. If the whole witch's brew had not begun to seethe again, paralyzing the energies which had been liberated so laboriously for the great tasks of the future. I do not fail to recognize how serious are the reasons which led to this new revolt. But ask yourselves whether these reasons are of necessity rooted in the system, or whether they do not much rather come from regions where the new system itself cannot exercise any direct influence, and to reach which it would be necessary that all the interested powers should act together with a confidence which is lacking present. To establish the confidence for this task is a part of the foreign policy which is essential today, a task for which, however, the system requires the confidence of those who should have the most direct interest in removing the reasons that are at present leading to an attack against the system. No one should doubt the good faith of the men and the movements who feel that they cannot repose their confidence in the system. But to realize the real state of affairs and to change it for the better, more is needed than overpoweringly strong convictions and the most disinterested and energetic will. An objective knowledge of the material is necessary. But the fact is that it is only where the material is fused that it can be surveyed, and the whole body of public statistics and investigations, of professional and political detailed work, all the knowledge of the mind of the people, of the claims of home and foreign policy, of the technique of government and of economics, are not sufficient to remove the barrier between the study, the party headquarters, the editorial office on the one hand and responsible officialdom on the other. For it is in government offices that the fruit of study are available in essence. The daily changing aspect is automatically recorded. The comprehensive plan is being built up step by step. Ratios are adjusted. The matters of first importance are sifted out and decisions made as to how and in what degree they are to be dealt with. This is so. And because it is so, and because it cannot be altered, without immediately making any responsible course of action, impossible in destroying the security of the right. Because this is so, no change of authority will bring about a change in the present state of affairs. What can it matter if one or other responsible leader in German politics goes and gives place to another? What can it matter, even if the whole machinery of government is suddenly put into the hands of a completely new set of men? The system will remain because the necessity for perpetual and constant achievement remains. And if it is perhaps going too far to say that the laws of this achievement are categorical and exist independently of human will, at any rate they possess the organic strength which represents the will of the people better than any parliament or any form of public opinion. Yes, gentlemen, you cannot escape the facts. However energetically you may advance against them, they remain and must be molded and adjusted. And even supposing that a revolution were carried through unanimously supported by the whole people, if the system which has built itself up by laborious detailed work were gradually to disintegrate, the whole organization to be reorganized, the same mechanical power would remain, though the tempo may be increased at which this mechanical power must be developed and exploited. Its magnitude can never be changed. And to attain this, we do not need a revolution. What we need is that the confidence of all should be placed in the system. The elimination of all the ridiculous obstructive ideas based on violence, which set themselves against the system, instead of fulfilling themselves in it, in the most economical way by constructive operation, in union with life, and for the attainment of the only possible results. For it is not true that the system is a rigid apparatus, a machine whose wheel runs down when the driving belts cease working. It is not a motor fed with doctrinal oil, which stops short when no more of this particular mixture is available. It is a living entity, and derives its life from the ideas of its era. What is the use of talking of rational political technique? Undoubtedly, it was the system that made it possible for Germany to enter the League of Nations. And what else does that mean but to take the battle for German security into the very territory of the so-called counter-Reich, a battle which could not be waged anywhere else? Because, even with us, actual political exigencies have proved themselves stronger than ideals. And because the League of Nations has now become the concentration field on which these political exigencies meet to do battle. Therefore, to cut oneself off from the League of Nations meant from the outset to renounce the greatest opportunities of foreign policy. Opportunities, which it is true, can only be tackled with rational technique. But to what end, and with what purpose in view? Why should it not be possible for us with our political technique to achieve the same national success in the gathering of the Counter-Reich? To use your term again, as Talleyrand achieved in his day for France in the organ of the Holy Alliance, the Congress of Vienna? The opportunity has been given to us to tackle the opponent with his idealism, and thus to force him to accept us as a partner, although he had hoped to keep us out forever, and to fight out the battle for the Reich on his own field, where he's most vulnerable. I will gladly, and the system will gladly, give credit to those who are making themselves felt all over the Reich in a serious endeavor to comprehend the essence of politics. And most certainly important and extensive objective point can be cut out of all this farrago. But, gentlemen, I maintain that there had long since been an objective point, and that it made itself evident, and even you cannot doubt it, at the moment when free economic enterprise, which was more or less necessary for progressive internal development, came to an end, when the state, which was just as much ruled by interests as society, as it were asserted its independence, assumed the initiative in economics and politics, The Chancellor freed the government to an extent hitherto inconceivable from the Parliament to which you are opposed. In short, created a concrete administration which, with its tendency to emphasize the authority of the state, should be particularly acceptable in nationalist circles. You may deplore, gentlemen, that the great act of reformation, for which the way has been cleared by this fact, is not being fulfilled according to an extensive, clearly expounded and generally illuminating plan. Of course you can deplore this, but you should level your complaints at yourselves, at all those who, through their opposition to the system, are making serious and united action impossible, who stand on one side, armed with mistrust, instead of holding themselves ready to infuse life into the bare bones of the organization and give it body by their vital and creative impetus. You are forcing the system to progress step by step, giving here and there a consideration to private interests which the generality find hardly tolerable, and only asserting its full power where the wisdom of others has failed. You may point out, gentlemen, that it was not until the hour of greatest need that the system began to intervene. Compelled by this need, it is true. But who is to say that the possibility of intervention was not inherent in the system from the very beginning, in the purpose of the system, and that this purpose did not embrace the will to intervene when the time was ripe? No sooner and no later. The time is ripe now, and you may well be dissatisfied when you contemplate the present state of affairs, which is neither flesh nor fish. But who is to say that this state of affairs is not provisional, does not already embrace the will, by supporting the banks, by a far-reaching participation of the state in banking interests, in economics, in society, by the expansion of public economic activity, by intervention in conditions of production and sale, by assuming financial control, to bring about a fundamental reformation of the whole structure of economics, and thereby to attain an integrity of the state which certainly is in our time. And if I may look back at Prussian history, not only in our time, the essential and only means to force the will to life of the nation to a might overpowering, and in the last resort, heroic effort. And you may gaze, my friends of the left, with enthusiasm towards Russia, and you, my friends of the right, with delight towards Italy, and you, gentlemen, who have not yet decided whether you are left or right, towards a glorious kingdom of the future. But here, on every side of you, a state is quietly growing, which has no need to be looking to every point of the compass for examples. The German state is growing here to fulfill German needs, is being formed. Under pressure, it is true, from the whole world, just as every real life is formed under the pressure of its environment. But it is being formed out of German material, out of the bitter distress of the German situation, and has within it all the objective points for which you are fishing with such praiseworthy zeal, lowering your rods into the fog. It is true that the stupendous process of German reorganization is proceeding slowly. I can disclose to you that it is sure, that it contains all the germs of German hope, that it is the quiver for all the arrows of German desire, and you can rely on it, all of you, if you do not prefer to draw a bow at random now, that the bow strings are humming. Broderman drew a deep breath. He continued, I know the reproaches that are made against the system. Some speak of cold socialization. For others, it is not socialistic enough. Well, you may call it what you like, but one thing is certain, it is seeking for the forms which show the greatest promise of being equal to the important tasks of the future. It was not by chance that the system's will to reorganization, as soon as it had the necessary freedom, turned first to establishing security in the East, and then to a revival of agriculture, to a revival, not a socialization. And if some methods give the impression of being socialistic, other methods give the impression of being far from socialistic. For a revival cannot be based on any one great political theory, to which everything has to give way, or be destroyed. It must be based on the needs of the community as a whole. And if the farmers, if agriculture, consider that their effective existence is essential for the community as a whole, then there is only one way of proving it, namely, by taking an essential part in the task of the system, from a point of view which it is not difficult to comply with when it is really honorable and seriously directed to what is essential. It is said that the state is oppressive, but nothing is being oppressed unless it makes a stand against the security of the right. And if it does make such a stand, then there will be no mercy, I assure you. But to want to stir up the storm now, and to cry for violence, when you have been crying for violence all along, is a game I don't understand. Gentlemen, what is it you actually want? Now that the system has at last got private interests and combines under the control of state authority, and has put them in the places where they can be useful, do you want, by destroying the system, to let them break loose again and assume command? Do you want to embark once more on the pointless and planless battle, until the opponents are at each other's throats again, without a single political purpose being fulfilled? Do you want a new system? There is no system in Germany, new or not, directed by no matter whom, which will not find itself faced with the same tasks, the same powerful forces, the same tendencies and objective points. Let us preserve what has been created and work more and more. The system has room for all. You will find all sorts of opportunities, not necessarily in the Reichstag. If that does not appeal to you, it does not appeal to me either, and it does not seem to be a sign of outstanding political and revolutionary instinct. When great movements, which are setting about to destroy the system, in order to put themselves and their valuable intelligence in its place, deliberately turn all their strength against the position which is today least representative of the system, the Reichstag, and stares though hypnotized at all the seats that have to be won there. It would be much better to begin the work of developing Germany's future in your own proper sphere, to find the best possible and potentially strongest form in your own associations, to bring your idealism into active TOE, operation with life, and thus to contribute to what you and I desire, and with us, the system. But to want to stand aside, with your heads perpetually in the clouds, your hearts full of intoxicating dreams, and on your tongues the proclamation of the one right and eternally marvelous salvation by the Soch, and so many Reich, to agitate for the destruction of the system. Oi, die. Broderman a violent gesture with the invisible sword. That is political romanticism. No, that is political romanticism, said Ive, standing up. He put his hands on the table, then took them off again. He seemed about to turn away, but then he wheeled round towards Broderman, and eventually stood leaning against the wall with his arms folded. That is political romanticism, he said. It is very much the fashion lately to talk of political romanticism the moment anything occurs in German affairs that cannot be turned to immediate practical use. I don't know whether it is because I am too stupid, or whether it is to be attributed to the state of public enlightenment. I have made inquiries in every direction, but I have always found that the perfectly correct description of a perfectly authentic phenomenon is continually being associated with a point of view which has no connection whatever with political romanticism in the original and pure sense of the term. I can very well imagine how political romanticism is interpreted by putting together all that people are thinking and saying and writing about those doctrines and opinions of today which have not yet acquired a conventional status. One has only to turn to the stump orators, party manifestos, or on a higher level, broadcast discussions, or even to the thick and learned tomes that are filling up the empty spaces on the bookshelves of science. But all these lack something which 100 years of liberal historical study has failed to see, is not capable of seeing, because it is contrary to their hypotheses. The only thing to do, therefore, is no longer to take the hypotheses, assumptions, and conclusions of this century as a basis, but to trace back the ideas of Romanticism to their source, if I may be permitted to say so. For if we wanted to attack the ideas of the past century on the basis of its own assumptions, we might as well adopt Marxism as our creed, for Marxism by itself is fulfilling this task admirably and with a certain amount of success. Since we do not want to do this, you are quite right to call us romantics, for the ideas of Romanticism, which this century is combating, denying, and eventually ignoring, and, to a degree, and in a manner which leads one to suspect that it does not fear that it will be conquered by them, any more than by Marxism, but that it simply does not understand them, lead to something in which neither the liberal epoch nor the system, which, to all appearances, is actually undertaking to liquidate it, have or can have any say, namely, a conception of the state. No doubt this may seem an astonishing statement to those who, at the word Romanticism, immediately picture young men sentimentalizing in the moonlight and setting out to search for the blue flower in the maze of politics. Although this might well be considered a more praiseworthy undertaking than trying to open an account with the Swiss bank. But political romanticism is far from being a happy land of tooting horns and vagrant ne'er-do-wells. Much rather, it is the first comprehensive attempt in German history to sift from its records the elements of the state, to remove from it the flotsam and jetsam of transitory intellectual tides, and from the knowledge thus gained to deduce far-reaching conclusions. I am, amongst other things, the elements of the state. He went on, so that we cannot be surprised that today, wherever a similar effort is being made, it is at least worthwhile to take every essential idea and to investigate what has already been thought on the subject in Romanticism. For in Romanticism is to be found every fundamental argument against the liberal century. It is impossible for us, once we set about the task seriously, whether or no we have made our own assumptions, not to find useful parallels in Romanticism. Actually, the intellectual situation today is in essence what it was 100 years ago. Today, as then, German claims are defending themselves against the ascendance of far-reaching iconoclastic ideas whose first beacons were lighted in foreign capitals. Today, as then, German youth is striving to find the source of these claims not in the existing political situation, not in the laws of evolution, but in an eternal quality of the nation. Today, as then, the authoritative political system stands between the two fronts, and the reactionary statesmen are ruling not on principles of Romanticism or of democracy, but on principles of enlightened individualistic absolutism, supported only by the confidence of the dynasts, and there is damned little to choose between that method and the methods of the present chancellor. No matter who he is or by what means he wins the confidence of the President of the Reich, the one thing that differentiates us from the Romanticism of those days is the iron infused into our blood by 100 years' experience and a world war, and the resultant certainty that we need not shrink from ways and means which the young men of those days had not the grit to tackle. So much for Romanticism, said I. As for the statement that the system has saved the existence of the Reich, that is simply an objective untruth. It is not the Reich that the system has saved, but itself, under the guise of being a state, and we have no intention of operating in the tissue of lies with which the system has distorted the act of its birth into an heroic deed, and is seeking today to justify the consolidation of its power in the eyes of history. If the system came into being because the parliamentary democracy succeeded, In the first years following the collapse, in playing off against each other, the forces fighting for possession of the right, regardless of whether their intention was to destroy it completely or to reconstruct it in new greatness. And then, in the most fact way, annihilating the exhausted combat, one after the other, with wise precepts and cold judgments. Then possibly that was an achievement that leads the system today to hope that it will succeed in playing off the newly formed forces in the same way again, in order to annihilate the parliamentary democracy, which has become an embarrassment, and the defective political instinct which vacantly counts the seats in the Reichstag may be very welcome to the system. But what has this achievement to do with the state? What has the sum of achievement of which the system boasts? And even if its value is called into question, the system may still take the credit for it. What has it to do with the state? If an attempt is being made today to eliminate monopolies, what is happening but a shifting of monopolies from one group of shareholders to another, turning the ramp of individuals into a ramp of the system? He continued, it would be better if the system could not even boast of an achievement. For then what justification would it have? What justification has a factory owner but his achievements? But the state cannot be managed like a factory. It would be fundamentally destroyed. That is a conception of romanticism, and to prove the correctness of this conception, there is no need to seek proofs in the last century. They are in front of our eyes, and nobody is more aware of them than the system. Otherwise, what need would it have to be appealing in all directions for confidence and bitterly bewailing that everyone is trying to stand on one side? Why otherwise is the system looking everywhere for its authority and is only able to find it among the men it would like to get rid of? Why the devil is there this anxiety to stand aside? Why does German youth consider it a crime to stretch out so much as a little finger to the system? Why is there this searching and feeling for distant and unknown, and all embracing and binding principles? Because without them, it is not worth making a decision. Because in every action, it is essential to have an answer to the question of the reason why. And the system has not been able to answer this question any more than the whole of the past century was able to answer it. Because at last, the certainty has awakened in us again, that every action and every attitude must rest on the unity of a great reason. That every political idea must arise from this unity, if it is to be of any value to us. And the state must be nothing else than the willing instrument to fulfill it. I do not want to bring God into the debate, said Ive, and then regretted it, but he continued, although it is hardly to be avoided, at least if we want to investigate the question of the source of any authority. What, for instance, is a marriage if it loses its sacramental character? Happy possibly, but not a marriage, simply a bourgeois arrangement which, after being deprived of all its legal and hereditary rights, can be turned by communism consistently and frivolously into a proletarian arrangement or repudiated altogether. What is a state if all its members do not serve a higher unity, if it has not arisen from the will to this unity? Comfortable possibly, but no longer a state, merely a bourgeois arrangement for the protection of a privileged society, which communism is justified in striving to destroy. For communism has no use for the state, and has never pretended to have a conception of the state which justified it in wanting it. I should like to know, said Ive, how the system justifies its existence in the face of communism, in the face of National Socialism. Merely by its indispensability? Well, it is just this indispensability which is being questioned. By its wonderful devotion to an achievement? Well, it is this very devotion to an achievement that the forces which are opposed to the system are combating. And if it be true that it is the objective power of facts which dictates the tasks of the future, all the more reason why they should be undertaken by anyone, and not only by the representatives of the system. But we want a state and not a system. We want a society which will consciously organize itself into a great national community, and not a heap of individuals thrown together more or less by chance, held together only by the frontiers dictated by foreign powers and by the political squaring of the circle of a universal reciprocity of interests. We want authority, but not the authority of decaying bank managers and economists, nor the authority of timid government officials who get cold feet at every measure, nor the authority of putrescent senatorial presidents and ministerial directors, nor that of the bigwigs who attended the last Reinhardt premiere, and make us heave if we merely see their faces in the illustrated papers, but the authority of men whom we know to be at one with our aims. We want a plan, a unified and complete economic plan, not the extension of public economic activity from the most diverse and arbitrary points of view brought about by force of circumstances, instead of by spontaneous impulse and excused on the ground of obstruction, which exist only in the system itself, but a fusion of all economic principles by co-related measures, beginning with the soil and covering transport, raw material, and eventually man, all of which already contain within themselves the urge to spontaneous cohesion. The system boasts that it has already produced a perfect organization. It has organized nothing except starvation and itself, and those badly. Wherever natural forms of production and society have been developed, they have been developed in opposition to the system. That is true, and whoever denies it is either a liar or blind. If today German youth is removing the frontier posts in Innsbruck and the Bavarian forest, it can wait, for whatever happens will be bearable. But what will be quite unbearable is that you, Lieutenant Brodermann, will be standing with your detachment not in Wedding but in Innsbruck, or the Bavarian forest, to set up the frontier posts again. For whose benefit? For the benefit of the Reich? For the sake of a principle of state? For the sake of the system which can tolerate no change, and which engenders the mistrust of those, by grace of whom, and in subservience to whom it alone lives, or can live. It is not by chance that for 10 years it has acted on the watchwords of others, and the only time it produced a watchword of its own, it dared to do so because it was a question of saving American capital with French money. It is not by chance that it sows tariff unions and reaps the Danube Conference. Not by chance that with one hand it guarantees protection of the currency, and with the other not only knocks on the head the economy which was moving towards freedom, but the whole economy based on a protected currency. It is true that the system cannot act otherwise, and for the reason that it cannot act otherwise, it is not a state, but the thing that it is justly described as a system, and the greatest of its achievements would be quietly to resign. Brodermann shrugged his shoulders. Schaffer was not pleased with Ive, but since he was accustomed to think in centuries, and in the present century he was only concerned with the coming century, the question of the system was no longer a problem for him. He objected to leading articles, and, this being a question which really only lent itself to discussion in leading articles, or with armored cars, he preferred to ignore it altogether. However, he made a few mental notes of subjects of discussion for subsequent evenings, arising out of what Ive had been saying. Nature of the state, from the romantic point of view, a planned economy. On what form of society should it be based? Autocracy and decentralization of financial resources, and the position of the Reichsbank. Subjects which seemed to him of sufficient interest to merit discussion within or without the system. I've continued, regard us, if you like, as idiots and criminals. Regard us, if you like, as people who have nothing else to do but dream dreams, with our heads in the clouds. But you see nothing, and you need to see nothing, of what is going on beneath the surface. what is being accomplished, on principles which are our principles, and in a direction which we realize to be our direction, and in work in which, even when we sit idly talking, we are taking our full share, has a different kind of anonymity from that of the system, from that of a loud speaker with no electric current. The time is past for attaching any value to profitable results, and those who think they can't get on without them are already in league with the devil. I will tell you why we cannot enter the system to cooperate with it, because we know that it is impossible to tell lies and compromise oneself for 10 years without being corrupted. The whole question is one of order, and it is not we, but the system which has to decide whether it will change itself fundamentally, whether it is prepared to free itself from all its liberal, parliamentary, and Western association, in order ultimately to become what it professes to be, a state, or insanity, or, asked Broderman. Or, said Ive, when the time is ripe to be smashed. Well, good luck to you, said Broderman. And Ive knew that Paragat was more likely than anybody to challenge him to take up a definite position. He did not avoid him, for after all, he had himself, with his defense of romanticism, deliberately provided the peg on which the explanation must hang. Actually, the rather non-committal adherence to romanticism, which he professed, corresponded to his rather non-committal conception of the idea, and was due to his desire not to shirk responsibility, since, after all, he might have invalidated the reproach by a flat disavowal. He had turned to romanticism much in the same way that the generation 10 years behind him had turned to football. He found it in his direct path as a means of distraction, which at first satisfied his intellectual requirements just as sport satisfied the physical requirements of his juniors. He was aware, therefore, that his confession of romanticism had about as much bearing on himself and on the task still before him as the official statement that football increases national efficiency. For, just as the pleasant Sunday afternoon exertion could only lie by a general concentration of feet on the ball, at most lead to an eventual loudly acclaimed victory for the home team, a representative victory, so too his preoccupation with romanticism, even if he applied himself to it with his characteristic enthusiasm, could only lead in the end to a standpoint comprehensive, perhaps, and theoretically important, but, regarded all in all, no more than a representative philosophy. For he had sorrowfully to admit that, though he might become familiar with the intellectual world of romanticism, with the exciting discoveries it had to offer, he could never live in it as he longed to live, in the bold theses of the Romantic school which revealed a deeper logic than had been possible for the last 100 years, as well as in the suggestions and fragments of Romanticism. He discovered references and opinions which had lost none of their force, and was able to formulate maxims for which he had long been seeking, conscious that they must lie hidden somewhere within himself, to follow lines of thought which bore almost directly on the needs of the times. Yet there always remained something which he found it difficult to accept. This something lay, however, in a quite different quarter from that in which those who described him and his like as romantics were wont to seek for arguments. He was not disturbed by the lack of the hard perception, which the machine age alleged to be necessary, probably to enable it the better to blunt it. This was easily compensated for by a greater sharpness of perception, by a scalpel-like sharpness which made it possible to cut out with accuracy from the chaos of ideas the fertile or unfertile germ. And to attain this attitude again seemed to Ive a task well worth endeavor. What did disturb him, as he admitted to himself, was the attempt of romanticism, which the whole nature of the movement made inevitable, determinedly to confine all the organic strength which lay at its disposal within limits within German limits, to create order more or less as an end in itself, whereas I've preferred to regard perfection of order as a means, not perhaps of snatching from heaven its ultimate mysteries, but certainly of driving the last non-German power from the earth. And when he looked around him, he had no reason to despair. The things that were stirring in the times showed him to be right, and anything that did not show him to be right, he could easily have proved to be something that was not stirring, or could have attributed it to the influences of another age. He found himself in complete harmony with the present, and he found the present pleasant, both of which facts might have astonished anyone who knew him and knew how he lived. Ive had really come to love the town, mainly because of its stimulation, which was a purely intellectual stimulation. So he flung himself into the whirlpool of discussions, delighting in their general ineffectualness, discussions that did not enrich him, that did not even lead him to self-knowledge, hardly acted as a cultural education, therefore, but rather made him plunge and rear, so that, in the dizzy leaps from postulate to postulate, all his inflammable susceptibilities were kindled. The recognition of the doubtful value of every point of view did not mislead him into voluntarily abandoning his momentary opinions, and he never knew whether this time he would not sink into the abyss. But he did not sink, for his hours of deepest despair were hours of despair of himself, of fear that he was not worthy of what was happening around him, of grief that he had not been called upon to make a complete sacrifice. Herein lay his distress, and from it sprang his will to attain the highest degree of self-restraint, in order to become worthy of the infinitude of which he was a part. This seemed to him to be the attitude of the soldier, ready to die for a fatherland that has not even a just cause of war. To know himself meant for him to learn the meaning of his environment, not only learn, understand. So he set about the task of understanding. He found plenty of opportunities for merely filling up the gaps in his knowledge, when he was driven into a corner, as he had been by Broderman, and was faced with the responsibility of making concrete statements about concrete things. He was fully aware that it was impossible for him to produce anything but generalities, and though he got no consolation from the realization that other people, placed in the same position, frequently had the same experience, still this fact led him to the discovery of what was probably the one argument which he ought to have flung at Broderman, namely, that concrete statements must be based on a concrete proposition, and the injustice of the system precluded any high sense of responsibility, which was a decisive reason for abolishing it. The longing to have the chance of being prime minister with dictatorial powers was widespread, and anybody who regarded this as childish only showed his complete incapacity to fill the office of prime minister. At that time, Germany was made up almost completely of frustrated prime ministers, and we cannot deplore this state of affairs, although we are far from being Democrats, since it reminds us of the romantic idea that it is simply a question of economy, that there is only one king, and if we were not obliged to be economical, we might all be kings. And although we cannot completely identify ourselves with Ive and his views, having long since found an intellectual sanctuary, and in the consciousness of being useful and worthy members of a commonwealth, which satisfies us and our hopes, can well do without entangling ourselves in such abstruse intellectual adventures. Still, we can follow with sympathy the path of this young man, which, after he had strayed into every type of misconception, and utilized the discovery of his error as a means to knowledge, did at length lead him to that inner forum, which now constitutes the foundation of our existence. And by so doing we find ourselves nearer to Ive's methods than we might have suspected, for all the discussions in which Ive took part so eagerly were more of the nature of soliloquies, in which no opinion was an opinion, but merely a friction surface to enable the searching mind to ignite. Thus we possibly have reason to be more astonished than Ivy, when we consider what an abundance of common conceptions existed silently, and proceeding from these, we can affirm that the results obtained did not represent the synthesis of the discussions, but even when as results they had the appearance of compromise, were throughout complementary to a higher ego, and, therefore, only synthetic as the expression of a universally applicable law which, without reference to the discussion, operated auspiciously for each individual. Let us at least try to understand the fascination of novelty which things, that for us have long since been a secure possession, must have had for Ive. Do not let us underestimate the significance of the facts which caused the young people of that period to make indiscriminate use of men, books, and events as instruments of sensation, on which they were able to harmonize the compositions of their fermenting personality, fragments from which the music of a whole epoch was derived, and which surely it is worth recording here. And if we turn our attention to those silently existing conceptions, we become aware how great a disparity there is between our own times and the times when they did not exist, and must acknowledge Ives' justification in regarding himself as a part of the future of our present. Thus, there really have been times. We can establish this fact for ourselves by digging out the documents from the archives, in which, for instance, the nation not only was not an established and clearly outlined conception, but was even denied as a phenomenon, was regarded as the devilish figment of the imagination of some self-interested power or another, as an invention to defraud humanity of its most valuable possession. And these were the views of clever, enlightened, and influential people, who were able to express them openly in their journals and at their meetings, without immediately being put in their places by a mob, outraged at this terrible insult to the general intelligence, and using the methods customary with an outraged mob. Far from it. They received attention and were believed, and even those to whom we must here give credit for respecting the idea of the nation did not do so in the conviction of its actual value, but merely considered it expedient, under the influence of the universal psychosis, to support the figment of the imagination as such, or even their own conception of the nation, very different from ours, as a necessary element in the subduing of the covetous masses. If we take all this into account, we cannot despise Ive when he spoke of the nation or the Reich for not being in a position to expound with clarity all the distinctive features so permanently associated with these ideas, down to the least important details which are so familiar to us. For anyone who was fortunate enough to experience, as it were intuitively, the conception nation, was taxed to the utmost to define this conception, and though we, in the satiety of possession, may be in a position to smile at this, we must guard ourselves against smiling at the seriousness which lay behind it. Ive was perpetually making new starts in his endeavor to grasp the phenomenon, to pin it down in words. He suffered perpetual setbacks. Again and again, he would be stimulated by glorious presentiments, but at every step he was confronted by a new field, full of such an infinite number of possibilities, which were always shifting and regrouping themselves, complementing each other or even destroying one another, that he might well have despaired instead, as he did, of perpetually deriving new hopes from it. For the fact that there was a purposeful relationship between all things was another conception that he was aware of from the outset, and it was this that held him to his task with such a high sense of responsibility. A single mistake would destroy the divine work of art, and the devil was always at hand to guide the hand of humanity. It was this, too, that produced the urge to try out every method. And if the empirical method ranked first, at least as a corrective, He did not shrink from regarding his specific experiences as of value, understanding by this not his personal experiences, but those things which everyone could claim as experience. It is true that in this quest his encounters with people could only be halting places, and when he found in Novalis the sentence, "There are Germans everywhere," Germanus is no more limited to any particular state than Romanness, Greekness, or Britishness. They are universal human characteristics, which only here and there have become remarkable in their universality. He was immediately compelled to strip this idea of its psychological garment, since for him, psychology had always meant the contradiction not only of philosophy, but of all intellectual processes, and wrap it in the cloak of historical reality. At once the old thought assumed a new meaning for him. Nation, Germanness, and culture became one to him, and the world fell into an order which might have satisfied and delighted him, if it had not seemed an even too easy process. The power of the present seemed conceivable to him only as a Western culture. The power of the Church as a nation in itself, as in Judaism. The deceptive frontiers merged and overlapped, and there seemed no harm in ascribing the characteristic figures to their correct environment. To include Dante and Shakespeare in Germanness, and to transport Thomas Mann with one bound into the West, which was his right sphere, even though he might still live in Munich. Suddenly, every problem was solved. All sorts of maxims formed themselves into a complete pattern. The ideas of a national communism and of a social nationalism disclosed their mysterious origin as a protest of Germanness against the West. Every duty seemed to spring spontaneously into place, and actually there was nothing left to do but quickly to outline a new program and step before the public. But, curiously enough, Ives was not yet satisfied. He did not find it difficult to survey the field of political inferences. The claim of Germany was easily sifted out. The unique claim of a German imperialism. The missionary task, as Schaffer called it. But the thing Ives was concerned with remained hidden behind the mountain. A dark premonition of storm. So the bold structure had to remain in his dreams as in the brilliance of the morning sun. Stone was laid upon stone. The temple grew up in architectonic majesty. Rich altars rose in severe line. Stained glass windows caught the light, dispersing its rays in all the colors of heaven through the building. A glorious agglomeration surrounding a small empty space. A sanctuary for the unknown God. Actually, every consideration faded. Whether the Reich was to be regarded as the static and the nation as the dynamic element of Germanness. What was the relation of the people to the Reich? That of a biological unity, or of a spiritual content. What was the relation of the nation to the Reich? All faded before the one great question. God. This was where Paragot came in, and Ives felt ashamed. Not because he would be obliged to give an adequate answer. Who could give an adequate answer? But because even to be silent would be worse than cowardice or lies. A doubt of the meaning of existence. He found Paragot in the studio. Helene was out, and the painter was standing completely absorbed before a large sheet of paper. So they retired to a corner, and Paragot swooped down like a bird of prey onto the fact that the Romantic movement had ended with the acceptance of Catholicism. I felt that it would only be a weak objection to say that this did not apply to Romanticism as a whole, but only to a section of the Romantics. The profession had not been an essential part of the Romantic movement. Still, he could point to the strong pantheistic attitude and the relation to mysticism, and then to the fact that the romantic and mystical elements in the Catholic Middle Ages had been essentially German elements. So Ives went straight to the attack, still uncertain of his position, and in great distress because the urge to speak, to explain himself in some way, was stronger than ever. Paragot was a recent convert, but he did not defend his attitude with the ardent zeal which this act of piety usually inspires. He admitted to Ive that it was not so much the means of grace as the church which offered him the means of grace which had attracted him. Not that he could not have believed with complete surrender, but, and he said, this as though he were speaking to his confessor, almost imperceptibly within the great unity the principal accent had shifted. All at once, I've understood why Paragot, who had recently told him of his wish to enter a monastery, had not been able to follow the step he had taken to its logical conclusion, because an even more important conclusion confronted him. In his case, what had been a spiritual urge would have become a flight. Not a flight from the world. Oh, thought Ive, if only we could once and for all rid ourselves of all the worn-out ideas. Not a flight from the world, but a shameful deceiving of God. Ive would have liked to measure swords with Paragot, but he saw now that this would only be possible in a quite different field. Just as Paragot, by his conversion, by his questioning resistance, had experienced an enrichment, since every action and every step forced him to new decisions, of which each one was a decision bringing him nearer to unity. But this very fact that he felt to be a perpetual benison, a continual gift of grace, removed him from the actual domain of religion, drove him from direct religious experience to the realization of an intellectual unit, which for him was the intellectual concept of the Reich. Just as for Paragot, it was the intellectual concept of the Church. He had no right to become, as it were, an intellectual, any more than Paragot had the right to become a monk. For that would have been to deprive of its motive force his painful insistence on being admitted to none but intellectual experience. Paragot had recognized this. He wanted to be capable of being a saint and a martyr, not to be, but to be capable of being. That is to say, it was an intolerable thought to him that the soil of the Church had become barren and no longer bore saints or martyrs. And the idea came to Ive once more that Paragot did not want to be more popish than the Pope, but was endeavoring to crystallize all his thoughts and actions into the salt, which would once more prepare the soil for abundant fecundity. Like Ive, he could only regard Christianity as an individual culture with an imperialistic bent, which was threatened by the prevailing influence of 19th century intellectualism in just the same way as the Reich. It seemed quite natural to Paragot to acknowledge that the same enemy was threatening both Christianity and the Reich, and it was the direct menace of this enemy that would mold the intellectual consciousness of the victims. Paragot said that he, too, regarded history as a perpetual transformation of immutable matter, the struggle for supremacy between the will to power of the individual, man or state, and the will to power, liberated and alienated from the individual. This meant to say that liberalism as a Western claim was not a tendency of the times, but a perpetual tendency confined to a particular period. In the end, every supremacy was an imposition of foreign elements, and it lay within its scope to complete this process, and it not only lay within its scope, but was its right. For, said Paragot, right is the persistent exercise of force, power is the guarantee of right, and supremacy is the authority for power. What we want to discover is from whom the authority comes. For the Church from the revelation of God, and for liberalism, and since the proclamation of 1789, for the West, from the autocracy of man. And for the Reich, asked Paragot. For the Reich from the autocracy of the Reich. For myself, he said, my duty is clear and must be clear. The Church can never forfeit her supremacy, whatever forms it may assume. She can and must attempt to keep the forms pure, to substitute living and pliant forms for those that have become rigid, to combat every incursion of a foreign will to power, and if it is not possible to hold the fortress against the violent onslaught, she must yield elastically, as torn flesh yields, in order that the wound may be healed. The body of the Church is full of scars, but never since the sword thrust of the Reformation, which aimed directly at her heart, has she been in such deadly danger as she is today, when the poison is creeping into her impoverished veins. In those days Ignatius Loyola arose, fully armed, to do battle for her eternal security with all the weapons of his day, the sharpest and most perfect weapons, whose efficacy has persisted through the ages. He arose as the general of an order which for 4 centuries was the pattern for all societies which have an organic yearning for infinite expansion and eternal endurance, of a spiritual worldly society, secret or not. Today again the need is there for the formation of a spiritual, worldly society, once more to save the supremacy of the Church, the organ of a militant Christianity, of the rejuvenated and resuscitated Church, to eliminate by its burning zeal the putrefied and the putrefying humor, to stand at all the fronts where the enemy columns are massed, to take up all the tasks which the secular powers have wrested from the Church in their presumptuous arrogance without being able to fulfill, and out of it all to build up intellectual power equal to the comprehensive task. For the Church can never forfeit her right to determine the structure of society, from foundations to summit, to keep a watch over every phase of life from the first cry to the last breath, and there is no order in the world for which she is not responsible. Every individual who acknowledges her carries the responsibility for the fulfillment of the divine mandate, and he who shirks the task may be able as a sinner to ask for the absolution of his confessor. But as a Catholic he can never ask for his own absolution. The Church has left a breach in her strict laws, and it is the duty of those who call themselves Catholics to fill this breach until not a crack is visible. The Church is faced with the whole tremendous responsibility, and it is hers and hers alone. And if she forfeits that responsibility today, then she has forfeited forever her supremacy. Only in the moment of greatest danger is the hope of victory renewed by a fresh onslaught, and never were hope and danger as great as they are today. Catholicism has got to make a move, but a move in which it no longer needs to compromise because it realizes the weakness of the Church's supreme position, but a move in which it can stand as the representative of regeneration, conscious of its strength, just as the Society of Jesus was the representative of regeneration, and at the same time the organizer of the attacking powers. And since every individual is faced with the task, this task is for every individual the everyday duty of his life. Every individual has to make a choice and establish his position, and if he is a German, it is a German position. That is, it is a position in which the highest duty is of first importance. For this, and this only, is the meaning of the Reich, to fulfill the divine mandate conveyed by the Church in the past, and to be conveyed again today, to fulfill what has already been demanded of us, and which we have failed to fulfill. Now sit down, Shay. Paragot said that he could not understand how the Reich could be founded in any other way. Was this mandate a perpetual one or not? And did not its repudiation signify a self-repudiation on the part of the Reich? The fact is, said Paragot, that the first impress of German consciousness, and the one that has held good until today, the Reich, did not arise directly from the native German content. It called itself the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. It was Christian and universal, and only handed on to the German nation. It is therefore possible for the German to make use of the Reich, if he recognizes the direction and magnitude of the task, and today is seeking new forms, which will make it possible for the Church once more to hand the mandate to the German nation. But it is impossible for the German to make use of the Reich on the basis of the Reich's autocracy, for this has never existed. Not you all. Has it never existed? Asked Ive. Or is it not rather that it has clothed itself, as it were, in the holy, and Roman and Christian and universal, and the garment has proved to be sometimes too big, and sometimes too small for the body of the Reich? If one makes use of the autocracy of the Reich, that means to make use of one's own religious sense, And then you have witnesses cropping up from Eckhart and Jacob Boehme and Luther to Nietzsche, searchers in whom the divine spark was to be found. And the paths they sought and their religious sense was determined in every thought of the omnipotence of Christian thought, that is, in Catholicism, said Perigot. Is protest in itself a sign of autocracy? We must certainly guard ourselves against probing for results. But since Scheller, it is impossible to rule out the result as being the ethical importance of the Reformation. And it is from him that we must estimate what was the result of the Reformation. And if God did manifest himself to Luther by a burst of thunder, it was the God of Christianity, and it was Luther who made it possible for Loyola to save the Church and lead her to a new greatness. If Germanus is a culture that fulfills itself in the Reich, it is a Christian culture, and it is Christian values which have determined it. It is impossible to deny this, but it is possible to deny Christian values as such. It is impossible to deny the Christian tradition, the Roman tradition of the Reich, but it is possible to date the beginning of the German Reich from today as the first beginning of German history. And if it cannot do without founding its significance on a divine mandate, then God will have to appear in a burst of thunder again on German soil, and this time a German God. And then the question arises whether he will not have to make use of the Reich again for a new protest. For a national protest, certainly, said Ive, for a protest of German spirituality against Christian spirituality, which has its origins in the spirit of Israel. But Perigot did not take up this challenge. And Ive said that he admitted that it all depended on how far it was possible from the basis of Germanness to attack the antagonistic spirit at its very roots, that with the unitary philosophy of the Reich, with its sin, philosophy, to borrow a term from Schlegel, the Reich stood or fell, and that it was not permissible to derive and correlate the theses of this philosophy from German intellectual sources alone, since in the end it was only a matter of interpretation. He admitted all this, and it did not even occur to him to seek out paths which led to the religious forms of pagan German antiquity, for the echoes of this period, which still rang in our ears, had no bearing on the primitive feelings of either religion or history. But since the real history-making power for the German nation was Christianity, the purpose of its content was to be found in the German manifestations of Christianity. And this purpose was in fact united enough in its main features to glean from it an idea of its characteristic manifestation. If it had made a political stand against the supremacy of Rome, intellectually it had made a stand against the ideas of Christian morality. Against man's free will, in fact, said Perigot. No matter how wide an historical survey we make, in the end, it is a question of individual choice. It is a tempting idea to try to attack Christianity at its core, to deny sin and guilt, to include in grace what the Church has excluded from nature, to permit man and nature to be merged in God, so that whatever happens takes place in God, and is therefore perfect. The idea is tempting and not new, I grant you. And if the Reich at one time found itself swamped by Christianity, once from the west and once from the east, there is no reason why it should not be possible to exchange Jerusalem for Mecca, the authority of the Pope for the direct communion with God of Mohammedanism. And then really, he said, it was probably a Western superstition to derive from the fact of Islamite immunity against the means of grace of the Western world the comforting statement that the idea of Kismet led to fatalism. Even if it were no longer possible to overcome evil, why should not responsibility to the world be altogether an act of heroic character? But what was impossible with the denial of a moral principle was the participation of the individual in any kind of order. What would disappear in the Reich would be the kingdom of the objective intellect, society. Stop, said Ive, that is not right. Responsibility to the world is not the question. That has been imposed upon us, and we are answerable. Responsibility means, he said uneasily, for Helene had come in and slipped quietly past them without greeting them. Responsibility means to be answerable for one's actions, regardless of consequences. For all actions, regardless of all consequences. What is the matter with Helene? He thought to himself. She disappeared behind a curtain which cut the studio off from a little kitchen, and Ive could hear her washing her hands slowly and thoroughly. Responsibility to the world means, therefore, said Ive, that the individual is deprived of none of his influence on the content of his action. What is the matter with Helene? He asked. She flung her hat and coat down in a corner and came towards Ive. But a little way from him, she turned round with a quick, angry movement and walked right across the studio, her high heels tapping sharply on the floor. The painter barely looked up from his work. Ive followed Helene with his eyes. The idea of free will, he said. Helene! Suddenly, she was standing close in front of him with her hands pressed on the table. You talk, she said, and drew her shoulders up. You talk, she said, and the tone of icy scorn hit Ive in the face like the lash of a whip. They stared at each other. Helen's forehead was a network of furrows. You talk, she screamed, and her breath beat hot on Ive's mouth. My God, why this sudden hatred, thought Ive, and he felt the blood draining from his face to meet the upward rush pumped up from his wildly beating heart until it nearly choked him. Go on talking, said Helene through her clenched teeth, and her words exploded through the studio. But I am fed up. I am fed up, she shrieked at the wall. Why do you work? She hissed at the artist. Give me that sheet. She snatched it from him, the wet paint coming off on her dress. She seized it quickly by the edge. Her hands tightened to tear it across. Then she stopped suddenly, cast a glance at the colors, stretched out her arms and returned it to the painter. Tear it up, she said. Tear it up. The painter, white and puzzled, dropped his brush, took the sheet, and tore it slowly across. Paragot and Ive jumped up. Helene stood in the studio like a slender flame. I can't go on, she said softly, and the piteous thin voice that came from her contracted throat filled the whole room with its torture. Ive stood motionless. The question leapt into his mind, stabbing like a knife. What do I know of Helene? Her face had puckered up like a child's, on the point of cry. But she did not cry. She stood upright with an expression of misunderstood sorrow. You talk and you paint, she said. You come to this studio, as you would to a lonely island, to talk and to paint. You talk and you paint on an island, and everything you do is a lie. A lie, she screamed threateningly at Ive. What do you know about all the things you talk about? This must be, and that must be, you say, and this can't be allowed, and that can't be allowed. But what is you do not see? I will tell you what is. Filth, she screamed, stamping about the studio. You and your responsibility to the world. But you have made no attempt to clean up the excrements that fill the whole world with their stink. If it were even a hell in which we are forced to live. But there are no more devils in human form, nothing but petty criminals. What of it if a policeman knocks me down with his truncheon? At least that is brute force, and I am prepared to shoot. But can you shoot slime? Do you call it life to be slowly choked by slime? But you talk. You condone the lie by ignoring it. Ah, Helene, said Ive. Be quiet, she said, turning to him. Then she said softly, and with a great effort, You think I am unjust, but I want to be unjust, for to be just is a lie. I want no more lies. I'm fed up with lying. You think I am in despair, but I want to be in despair, for all hope is a lie. Haven't I done my utmost? Haven't I even done what I myself should never have thought possible? Who can say that I'm a coward? Do you think I would let myself be conquered by the inevitable? When have I ever given in? Am I daunted by the shoemaker, the baker, or the tailor whom I can never pay? And do you care a damn? Do I flinch at my journeys to film studios, to editors, to Jakobson? Journeys that you know nothing about, that you probably regard as shameful, bitter, disgusting. But for me, just street walking. And you don't know this? You don't see it, don't realize it. You tolerate a prostitution because it's legal, because it is so, as though it had to be. But it must not be, my God. It must not be. I am fed up. And you talk, and put on a short-sleeved dress when I go to see Jakobson. And I cross my legs when I am waiting in the newspaper office. And I undress in front of every producer when I want to get a part for 3 days at 25 marks. I don't mind standing naked before the whole world if it is necessary. But it is not necessary. It is vile obscenity. Do you think I'm prudish? Do I jib at realities? But this is not reality. This is low-down, disgusting vulgarity. Am I afraid, of passion? When I love, I abandon myself. But I won't be dragged into everyone's bed in the interests of business. I won't be pawed by every fat swine. I won't be petted by every perfumed bundle of wadding. I am fed up, fed up, fed up. And you talk. You talk of free will and guilt and answerableness and supremacy and responsibility to the world. That has long since been divided up amongst the filthiest pack that ever existed, who have risen to supremacy from the sewers, and you can't smell their origin? You can't see the dirt in every film they reel off, in every popular tune they thump out, in every column they write, in every word they say? Either you are dense or corrupted. For you talk. You put up with it. You have theories about it. You're so superior, aren't you? Nobody will listen to you, and you are proud of it. But they listen to the others, to these creatures. They sit firmly implanted with their fat bottoms on every seat that's worth sitting on. They sit at every telephone, at every microphone, at every desk. And you may dance to the tune they call. And you do dance. You dance around in a circle with all your talk, to their music, and you are grateful if they praise your clever steps, and are wounded when they laugh at your cape. Respectable people. Swine. And so are you. You talk of duty, and you don't see your first and only duty. You talk, and are as independent as is possible for anyone to be today. You are not on a string as we are, who have to tremble if they take it into their heads to cut us down. You have the unique good fortune to be able to talk, but of the things that matter you don't talk. Talk, did I say? You don't shriek them out, call them from the housetops. You are cowards from ignorance. You lie from arrogance. But you are cowards and you lie. Cowardice and lies, she snapped at Ive, as though she were spitting at him. Be silent if you cannot talk of what should be talked of. There is no excuse. For the rest of the world, perhaps, but not for you. If you do not stand up to bear witness against pestilence and dung, who is to? But you are too grand to do such a thing as walk the streets. I am a street walker. I let myself be spat on and besmirched, and I am in damned fine company. In company that has got used to being spat on and besmirched. They think it is the correct thing, and if they didn't think it the correct thing, wouldn't dare to make a stand against it. They have to take part in it, have to spit and besmirch in their turn, to behave as though they were in a brothel, and must not be surprised at being treated as though they were in a brothel. And you tolerate this. You see and talk of other things. And if the filth rises as high as your noses, you too take a mouthful and spit it out again, and behave as though that were the end of it. What heritage are you waiting for? Waiting until it has been squandered away, and not a rag is left. Waiting is treachery. You are traitors. Petty traitors. Traitors with no character. You're just like the others. You are not even as efficient as they are. You talk of power and the others have it. You talk of decisions and the others make them. You dream of deeds and the others act. Just the same with art. You think they don't understand it, but they understand it better than you do. They know what is dangerous. You don't, and you aren't dangerous yourselves. Leave me alone, said Helene, pacing up and down. You can think I am hysterical if you like. I have a right to be hysterical, but you are worn down. All your corners have been gnawed as though by rats. And you don't know it. You don't see it. You don't realize it. You talk of battle and do nothing but tilt against yourselves. You talk of attitude, and of course, one shouldn't mention these things, but there are a few people who, before they think of attitude, want to fill their bellies. I am one of them, and I don't care about my attitude. Leave me alone. I'll be quiet. Nothing has happened. Nothing that does not happen every day. I wash my hands every day, and my soul, from the shame that this should be necessary. Nothing has happened. They are making a new film. I am playing a harlot, 15 yards of her. I have to give a side view of my left breast, naked. My breast was the most beautiful of all those that were in the running. Nothing has happened. The article has to be altered. They said I had a slight anal complex. They said it was only because I was such a charming little woman that they were keeping me on in spite of the general cuts. They said they wanted articles about the spring in Mentone because of the holiday season. I shall write the articles. I have never been to Mentone and shall never go. And they know it. Nothing has happened. Everything is grand. Better than I thought. No, I am not embittered. Did my voice sound shrill? I have been having a singing audition. I have to go again tomorrow. The dream of a night from the novel War in the Dark. I do so enjoy dancing in the open air. Perhaps I shall get taken on. If not, thousands of others are in the same boat. I want some paint and canvas. I'm going to the Porza Ball tonight. Why? I promised Jakobson I would. Maybe he'll buy the picture after all, if I go. He said he was enchanted. He says he knows a connoisseur of erotic pictures. He knows exactly what I think of him, and that obviously amuses him. You must come with me, Ive. What am I to go alone? Come on. Put on an old jacket and go as an Apache. I'm going as an Amazon, with a whip, a short skirt, and high boots, because I know that's what Jakobson likes. Is Johan Powell? 16s. Helene did not say a word in the taxi. She sat upright, 1 foot forward, and peered through the mirroring window pane onto the road gleaming in the headlights. Occasionally, as they passed a street lamp, by its light Ive could see her thin, pale face, bright red lips, and motionless metallic green eyes. Over her dress she was wearing a silk cloak, which she had made herself out of some odd pieces, and she held it together at the throat with her slender bare hand. On the corners of her fingernails, Ive could still see a trace of paint, like a dried-up trickle of blood. Ive had a sudden desire to work madly. Anything rather than the torture of seeing Helene like this in her wretched, shabby, trumped-up silken finery, in this musty, dirty taxi, smelling of sweat and stale smoke, sitting behind the driver in his brown suit. He turned to her and said abruptly, "Let's turn back. Don't let Jakobson have the picture, Helene. I'll buy it. Wait a few days, 2 or 3 days. There's still some money owing to me for the article on the butter tax. I have a commission for a series on emigration. I'll begin this very evening. I'll get the money somehow. Do you hear? The picture is mine." "Ayol." Helene did not even turn her head. "You don't understand," she said, and Ive was silent. There was a crackle of bare, wet branches scraping along the roof of the taxi, the sound of grinding wheels. In the crude yellow light stood the commissionaire. Helene jumped out and went towards the entrance. Ive put his hand in his pocket, stopped short, and at that moment he would gladly have snatched the pistol from the policeman, standing stiffly at the corner, and made an end of everything. "Helena!" he called. "Oh, of course," she said, turned round and came back. She fumbled in her purse, without looking at Ive. "I'm 30 pfennigs short," whispered Ive. "Don't make me mad," he said. "That's mean." "You don't understand," said Helene, and paid the taximan. Cars rolled up. The policeman made a sign. The commissionaire opened the doors. He did not open the doors for Helene and Ive. Ive would have gone in, but Helene waited until the commissionaire returned. "Open the doors," she said. With a glum face, the commissionaire pushed against the doors with his elbow so that they opened just widely enough for them to pass through one at a time. Ive would have gone in, but Helene waited. "Open them wide," she said, and looked at the commissionaire. Slowly, he pushed the doors wide open. "Thank you," said Helene, and went through. Ladies in fancy costume or in evening dress were standing in front of long mirrors. Helene threw her wrap on the cloakroom table. Ive stood behind her and noticed how her brownish shoulders were drawn together with every movement she made. He took off his coat, folded it so that the torn lining would not show, and waited. Helene powdered her face. A girl with long black stockinged legs, a white frock, and a cap with wide-spreading flaps, bent down to pull up her stocking. "Mickey Mouse," thought Ive, and at the same moment noticed a hippopotamus in a tailcoat approaching Helene. "That's Jakobson," thought Ive. He took the cloakroom tickets and felt a sinking in his stomach. Blindly he felt in his pocket, but there was money. Helene must have put some there. He went up to Jakobson like a drunken man, pulling into place his ridiculous coat, sizes too large for him. He took a rather soft hand and smiled, and cursed himself for smiling. Then he trotted after the two of them. "Heavens," he thought to himself, "since when have I suffered from an inferiority complex?" He caught himself trying to look at ease. "That's it," he thought, "as soon as you can put a name to it. The thing exists, not before. Facts are created, not conquered, by consciousness of them. You don't get classes until you get class consciousness. The problem doesn't exist till then. What class do I belong to?" thought Ive. Certainly not to that one. Certainly not to the Mickey Mouse world. "Nothing but shit," Clausheim would say. Clausheim, B. Ive no longer tried to look at ease. I should like to know what Dr. Sigmund Freud would make of Clausheim, he thought, and smiled with delight at the idea. A waiter pushed a chair out of the way in front of him. Ladies and gentlemen passed by him. The ballroom had been artistically decorated with gay festoons in blue, red, and yellow. Jakobson had had 2 places reserved. Ive seized a chair for himself, expecting that any minute a gentleman would come and say, "Excuse me," but no one came. They sat exactly opposite the band of unemployed musicians in dinner jackets. This was probably one of the usual charity balls that show a deficit. He looked attentively at the cellist. He was an elderly man with rimless glasses and a crushed expression. He was not smiling like the conductor and the man at the percussion instruments, who by knee gyrations and all sorts of contortions of the shoulder joints gave the impression of being in exceedingly high spirits. On the dance floor a number of couples were moving. A dense mass of bodies was circling round the small free space in the center. But there was no uniformity to be seen in the steps. The couples merely moved to the rhythm of the music. A few of the men only were in fancy costume. Most of them wore simple smocks, or white flannel trousers and light shirts with a scarf round their neck. A number of them had blue and white striped sailor jerseys with short sleeves, which made them look very audacious. The women leant back seriously in the crooked arms of their partners. From time to time, at a particularly long drawn-out note of the muffled trumpet, one of them would raise her leg, stretch it out stiffly, and then bring it gracefully down again. From time to time, one of them would smile, throwing back her head and straining on her narrow shoulder straps. Helene was dancing with Jakobson. She was slightly taller than he was, and his arm was round her hips. Helene looked down at him, so that she seemed to have her eyes closed. The Mickey Mouse stuck her bottom out well away from her partner and held the string of a green balloon in her hand. Many of the ladies had balloons, and the swaying of the gay-colored globes above the monotonous swarm of heads gave the scene its appropriate character of movement and color. Ives saw Schaffer in a black Russian blouse and a saucy beret, and he would have thought he was intended for an anarchist if he had not known his lamentable predilection for roller skate. He was talking to a communist whom Ives knew and who had turned up blatantly in a brilliant red silk shirt. Ives walked across between the dancing couples to greet Schaffer, but halfway across the room he stopped. Why should I? He asked himself, turned round, and pushed his way back through the crowd. As soon as the music stopped, there were a few seconds' silence. The scraping of feet and hubbub of voices only began again slowly. On nearly all the tables there were a few bottles of wine and plenty of bottles of lemonade. Helene returned on Jakobsson's arm, flicking her ridiculous little whip in front of his eyes. Ives pushed back the glass that the waiter set in front of him. Helene nodded at him quietly, rested her chin on her hand, and looked silently into the room. Jakobsson, too, was silent, smoking a very black cigar. In the adjoining box, someone was saying, "You see, I'm of opinion that the Nazis should be given a chance to see what they can pull off." "Yeah, and older." Jakobsson looked across furiously. At one of the tables, some girls in very daring evening dress were laughing, and every head was turned in their direction. Now and again, men would pass along the gangways behind the boxes, cigarettes held negligently in their hands, scanning the tables with astonishing equanimity, as though they were looking for someone, which, of course, was not so. Occasionally couples met friends, stopped, shook hands and laughed, asked hurried questions about things that didn't interest them, nodded, and passed on, turning round to wave goodbye. A gentleman spoke to the waiter, came up to Ives, and tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me," he said, but Ives did not excuse him, going out of his way to be insolent. The gentleman seemed to have expected this. He shrugged his shoulders, took another chair, and went away. The music began again, and Helene rose to dance with Jakobsson. "Don't bother me with communists," said someone in the adjoining box. "I tell you there isn't any danger of communism in Germany now." Ives drummed with his fingers on the tablecloth, which was gradually getting soiled from ash and cigarette ends. He drew a few lines on the cloth with a burnt match, and then looked again at the dancers on the floor. Schaffer, too, was dancing. The muscles of his face were set as he made his steps, and he looked completely idiotic. He looked up and caught sight of Ives. For a moment it seemed as though he was going to leave his partner and come over, but of course he went on dancing. One gentleman was attracting attention because he was wearing very elegant brown evening clothes. "That's the famous criminal advocate Schreivogel," said someone in the adjoining box. "He's only famous because he turns up at every ball in brown evening clothes." A Hamburg carpenter, to the accompaniment of much laughter, was trying to drag a girl out to dance with him, but since he did not succeed, he sat down again and rocked backwards and forwards on his chair. Helene passed by. She was looking down at Jakobsson, so that she seemed to have her eyes closed. "What is Jakobsson getting out of that?" thought Ives. But he was dancing with obvious pleasure. "Of course, he's not an enemy," thought Ives, nor was the commissionaire an enemy. But is that a reason, he thought? In any case, Helene possesses something that I wasn't able to display. Discipline. A lady in a close-fitting silver-lame dress, tall, fair, and beautiful, stepped hesitatingly into the box and gazed across over Ives' head at the dancers. She stood thus for a little while, and then Ives noticed that she was leaning heavily against his chair. He turned round slowly and offered her a cigarette. She said, "Thank you," in a soft voice and smiled at him. He gave her a light without speaking and turned back towards the room. After a little while, she walked away. He was sorry for this and rose, but sat down again thinking, "My limbs feel as heavy as lead." Helene and Jakobsson returned. "Enjoyed yourself?" asked Helene. "Immensely," said I. "Let's go to the buffet," suggested Jakobsson. Helene thought a moment and then said, "Later, perhaps." In the adjoining box, someone said, "Now, Bruning, he's a man. Look how he dealt with the banks. He didn't go far enough, unfortunately, said someone else. If you went and asked for reasonable credit. Jakobson fondled Helene's hand. Helene withdrew her hand, but slowly. Jakobson looked fixedly in front of him. All three of them stared into the empty room. On the broad sweeping steps that led up to the orchestra stand, some couples were seated, the ladies with their legs stretched out, smoking and laughing. In the present crisis, said someone in the adjoining box. Jakobson lost his temper. What do they mean by crisis? He said, it's all a question of confidence. If everybody talks about a crisis, we shall never get on our feet again. He looked at Ive. The main thing is to get up off one's backside somehow, said Ive brutally. Unpleasant fellow, thought Jakobson. The music started up a waltz. Let's dance, said Helene to Ive, and Jakobson leaned back, taking a very black cigar out of his case. Yes, said Ive, going up behind Helene. Helene danced well, but she always tried to take the lead. She danced very quickly. Ive looked into her face. She looked down at his shoulder, and it seemed as though her eyes were closed. Ive stopped abruptly in the middle of the room. Listen, he said excitedly. This won't do. You came here to sell the picture to Jakobson. Please be consistent. Yes, said Helene softly, and it sounded like a question. They danced. He could feel her tense muscles through the thin material of her dress. They danced quickly and distractedly. A wave of gaiety seemed to come over the crowd. Faces were flushed, and many were laughing. Jakobson was leaning over the side of the box and smiled at Helene. She nodded back to him gaily. They danced away from the other couples until they came to a clear space, where they twirled round wildly. Round and round, first to the left, and then to the right. But Helene's muscles retained that strange hardness, not the hardness of metal or bone, but like a frozen towel. When the music stopped, everybody clapped. But Helene went up to Jakobson while the others began to dance again. I followed her slowly. Jakobson was rocking to and fro on his chair and happily blowing away on a toy trumpet. His cigar was burning away on the earthenware ashtray. Helene stuffed her ears, laughing. Manchuria showed us what the League of Nations is up to, said someone in the adjoining box. What, Harriet? He's a Philistine too. Helene did not move her hand. She leant towards Jakobson and laughed awkwardly. The rouge on her lips had worn off and remained only as a reddish shadow at the corners of her mouth. What lovely teeth, thought Ive. Helene fixed a small green cap on Jakobson's bald patch. It slipped and sat askew on the back of his head. Jakobson made an amused grimace. He edged nearer to Helene, pushed his horn-rimmed glasses down onto the tip of his nose, and peered happily over the top of them. Clown, said I very loudly. But beneath his layers of fat Jakobson concealed a first-class character. I see, he said, suddenly serious to Ive, that you're determined to insult me. Good God, I can understand that, he said. It must be difficult nowadays for young men of your stamp. You can't adjust yourselves to life. Ive laughed aloud, and rejoiced that his laughter sounded as natural as it was. No, he laughed. I certainly can't adjust myself to your life. Jakobson turned to Helen and said quietly, Well, dear lady, I am prepared to buy the picture. You mustn't be offended if I tell you frankly that it doesn't yet seem to me to be absolutely mature work. All the same, I see the talent, and I consider it my duty to encourage talent. You've told me the price, and I am prepared to pay it. I think it's a bit high, but everyone should know his own value. Already dull. Of course, said Ive. After all, art is not a luxury, but a favor towards the artist, from the dealer. Nomen est omen, said someone in the adjoining box. General von Schleicher. Jakobson wrote a check, and, covering it with his hand, passed it to Helene. Helene hesitated and held it for a moment folded up in her hand. Put it in your stocking, said Ive out loud. Helene suddenly looked like a helpless child. Why do I tease her? Thought Ive. What a low-down swine I am. But Helene quietly put the check in her handbag. You're a very naughty boy, she said almost tenderly. Thank you, she said to Jakobson. That is a great help to me. I'll talk to your husband about the exhibition later, said Jakobson, smiling at Helene with fatherly kindness. Ive sat back as though dazed. A group of young men were laughing and making a commotion between the tables. They were trying to burst the ladies' balloons with their cigarettes. A very young girl in wide white trousers and a close-fitting jersey escaped from them and made a dash along the gangways. At last she came to a halt and leant, breathing quickly, against the wall of the box. 5 cigarettes took aim at the balloon, which exploded with a weak report. 5 young men, with their heads thrust forward, gazed breathlessly at the girl. She stood still a second, looking in front of her with narrowed eyes. Then with a deft movement she pushed the cavaliers aside and ran off. A gentleman in a tailcoat, with a small white rosette in his buttonhole, bowed to Helene and handed her a card. Madam, you are requested, he said, bending his head, to take part in the beauty competition in 10 minutes' time in the Blue Room. You're not bail. I saw that there was an understanding between the gentleman and Jakobson. Helene, he said. Well, said Helene, I'm only being consistent, she said, thank you, and took the card, rolling it between her fingers. Schaffer came into the box. How are you? He asked. Splendid, thank you, said I. And you, having a good time? A nice party, he said. Well, I don't know, on the whole I think it's a bit stupid, said Schaffer, looking fixedly at Helene, obviously wishing to be introduced to her. But the idea never occurred to I. Of course, your wife isn't here, he said. How is she? Thank you, very well, said Schaffer. Well, till Friday evening, and he departed. The Mickey Mouse had given rise to great amusement by losing her tail. Helene went off with Jakobson to dance. Ive got up clumsily and paced through the gangways, his hands thrust into his coat pockets. Couples were camped out all over the stairs. Ive strode over them with wide steps. Pardon me, he said. Oh, it's all right, said a girl, brushing off the patches of dirt that the sole of Ive's shoe had made on her sleeve. The lady in silver lame was leaning heavily and blissfully against the chest of a very young Argentinian, her blonde head pillowed on his broad shoulder. They both sat motionless looking at the dancers. As Ive passed by, he noticed that she was pregnant. He stood behind the bandstand, next to the cellist, and looked into the room. He tried to find Helene among the dancers, but he could not see her. Presently she passed close by him, coming up the steps accompanied by Jakobson, and disappeared with some other girls through a door. Ive leant over the balustrade of the steps and stared into the room. When we were marching back, in the war, he thought, we used to dance nearly every night. The chaps were crazy. 40 kilometers covered in the day, and then, at night, instead of flinging themselves down exhausted, started dancing straight away. Sergeant Bruckner was furious. You can keep on the hop all night, but when it comes to changing guard, all at once you're too tired. In Kirchenhain, the parish priest had warned the girls on Sunday from the pulpit that the soldiers were all infected. And in the evening, what a shindy there was in front of his house. He had had to take back his words. But of course the padre had been right. That was an achievement, he thought, the way the scourge of venereal disease had been stamped out afterwards. He had learned to dance out there. In any old barn, the rain coming in at the roof and the wind blowing through the cracks. When they had had a runt ration, one of them would play on a comb covered with paper, and they caught hold of each other and stamped away in their hobnailed boots and their dirty, crumpled trousers. Ive caught hold of his comrade's sword buckle and looked at his bronzed, freckled neck emerging broad above his gray tie. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It resounded on the floor of the barn. Odd that lately he so often thought about the war. Every night during the last few weeks had been filled with wild dreams about the war. I was never so frightened as I am in my dreams, thought I. Wait a bit, old chap. You were even more frightened. You were contemptibly frightened. Or is that a pose? The pose of an old soldier. Everything is a pose. But always the feeling, that won't do, the others are looking. But nobody was looking. When the mud used to spurt up in front of your eyes all over the place and you thought, you've got to go through that now. Say not the hardest tasks to act. The moment, the emotion gives you strength. The hardest task of all is to decide. Something like that. Who was it said that? Grill Partzer? Of course. Odd. But once over the top, it was finished as though it had never been. As completely vanished as dream terrors on awakening, all you feel is a huge astonishment. Then the fat old innkeeper's wife brought breakfast. Miserable breakfast, 2 rolls and a lump of butter, and the refreshing beverage. You can only swallow down such loathsome things standing up and in a hurry. Every morning the flabby rolls made you long for the war bread, the dark, bitter hunk, already slimy or going green in the cracks and turning into hard lumps in your mouth. But how they enjoyed it. Of course, they grumbled and longed for white, flabby rolls. And when they were hopping round in the barn, man with man, sweating like pigs, they probably thought of girls in evening dress and caressing dance music. God, the guards may die, but they do not surrender. Whenever I've rode on an omnibus, he always chose the seat on top, right in front, exactly over the driver, who was crouched down below in his little cabin, stinking of oil and benzine, in an atmosphere of hot dust, in his black leather jacket, like the driver of a tank. And every time he thought of General Gallieni, who saved Paris by scraping up all the men he could find in the town, putting them into every kind of vehicle, taxis, carts, motor, buses, emptying the town of everyone who could fight, and bore down on the front with everything he could find that had wheels. Sale politique was written in Gallieni's diary. The town, which had come into being by traffic, was saved by the instruments of traffic, and by the will of a soldier. And of all those who crouched on the rattling carts, everyone knew what the object was. An astounding picture! And now, day after day, this pointless riding hither and thither, and you always knew after all. You are only imagining that this is of any importance. Fruitless journeys, all fruitless journeys. Often, when he walked through the streets at night, passing the news vendors, waiting taxis, the male prostitutes outside the El Dorado, the terrible pictures of the Scala, he dreamed of mine throwers. If you stuck a knife in the barrel, the bolt always stuck in the breech, the mine fell down into the muzzle and sprang up again. 8 shots into the air, and the 9th in the barrel, until the first burst. Or, if the mine thrower wasn't constructed for spreading fire, you stood on the gun carriage behind, took hold of the lanyards and pulled. Bang! The wheels jumped round quicker and quicker at every shot. You were flung back, then forward, then for the next. If the mine burst in the barrel, it was all up. You could see the projectiles flying, like black, shrieking, twittering birds, to the highest point of the trajectory, and then nothing more. But if you stood where they hit the earth, you could only see their fall. Queer. Why exactly? From Martin Luther Strasse over the houses to Victoria Louise-Platz, Berlin has never seen such a thing. From the Pariser Platz to the Kroll. If one of those things were to get to work here, right in the middle of the crowds, Berlin has never seen such a thing. But we have seen it. Nobody wants to die. Why does nobody want to die? Is this better than dying? Whoa. Hush. Oh, the beauty competition. Everybody stands up. All eyes are turned upwards. First prize. Elected as the beauty queen of the Porza Ball, Mrs. So-and-so, a doctor's wife. Not Helene, of course, Mrs. B. So and so. Quite pretty, but bloodless. Where's Helene? Nimzala Yarni. Second prize, third prize. Dancing. Would you perhaps like to die? Are you any better than anyone else? Where's Helene? What are you doing here? Is it any excuse that you find it revolting? Do you think that nobody else finds it revolting? They are masks and ghosts. And you, aren't you a mask and a ghost? Is that all you learned from the war? To be a mask and a ghost? And to dissipate your trivial days with trivial dreams? You must know what you're dying for. You need not know anything. Jakobson knows. You have lived like a swine, a stupid swine, too grand to wallow in the mire, like an hygienic swine that produces tasteless ham. Here you stand, and the music is playing, and down below Schaffer is dancing with Mickey Mouse. And you live in the consciousness of the Reich, and Klaus Heim lives in the consciousness of the prison cell. And you talk, and he is silent. And he is a man, and you are a weakling. Where's Helene? Why did you come here? Jakobson has bought the picture. Curse the picture! Where's Helen? The box is empty. Perhaps in the buffet. The lady in silver lame is still lying on the faithful breast of the Argentronian. Helene is not in the buffet. Helene isn't dancing. Jakobson isn't here either. I hope you're enjoying yourself, Schaffer. No, I haven't been drinking. Not a drop. Make room, man. You're mine. She isn't upstairs either. Perhaps in the blue room? Empty. Out of the way. Don't talk rubbish, idiot. I must find Helene, I must. The stairs? Over there, perhaps? You can't see across to the other side. The box is empty. What next? My cloakroom ticket? Waiter, has the bill been paid? Of course. With Jakobson. Impossible. Helene wouldn't go with Jakobson. Why not? No. You don't understand Helene. He was very polite to her, full of a vulgar, disgusting, slimy politeness. No, Helene with him, that's impossible. My coat, yes, that one with the torn lining. What next? But if she isn't with Jakobson, with the hippopotamus, with the son of a Mickey Mouse fantasy, him and her, ludicrous, if she had gone home, she would surely have said something? What did she say? What did she look like when I last saw her? Last? What does that mean? Quick, quick, said Ive out loud, and found himself standing alone in the vestibule. Without thinking, he looked in a long mirror and saw his reflection. He was shocked at his reflection. He looked simply ludicrous, shamefully and humiliatingly ludicrous. He knew he hadn't the money for a taxi, and that made him feel absolutely helpless. He stood, with his coat half buttoned up, his hat in his hand, in front of the door, and tried to gather his thoughts. But he was completely empty. Nothing would come into his mind but the old, forgotten military formula. Helmets off for prayers. He put his hat on. Now Helene is done for, he thought mechanically, without really knowing what he meant by this. He pulled himself together and walked on aimlessly for a few steps. He walked quicker and quicker, straight in front of him, towards the black trees, seeking out the dark spots, as though he would find Helene there. She is at the studio, he thought, and meditated. Or with Jakobson. But this seemed more than he could bear. Not with Jakobson, oh God, not with Jakobson, anywhere but there. Helene can't do that to me, he thought, and was terrified. He felt a choking fear. Dimly he saw what was possible for Helene. He did not quite grasp it. It came upon him like a thunderbolt. Helene could do this thing to him, knowing that it was necessary for him, and for her to be strict and bitter to the very last moment. He stood still, under the trees, and realized that his whole body was covered with a sticky sweat. Until the very last moment. Then I must not live any longer, he thought. Now it is decided. I can't live any longer. Everything is finished with, including responsibility to the world. He looked up at the trees. Above his head spread the broad, strong branches. There is no other way out. She washed her hands, her face, her whole body. She took clean linen from the cupboard. The folds must still be visible. The linen smells faintly of soap. Her legs stick out of it like a rag doll's. What can she do after this terrible humiliation? And she has been carrying this about with her for years, and we knew nothing of it. We didn't see it, didn't realize. Of course we knew. We were cowards we did not want to see. It was so pleasant not to realize it. Good God, he thought. Good God. All lies, Helene had said. All lies. Guilt or responsibility, how we enjoyed juggling with words. You do not understand, Helene had said. But Helene understood, and she was an abandoned woman, had been for years, as long as she could remember. That is why she was justified. That was why she did not recognize guilt, but was responsible, was above all pettiness, was unassailable, unconquerable in her inmost soul. She was. The words kept palpitating in him, and suddenly taking a short turn towards the town, he began to run. He ran past the entrance of the hall, which he had just left, and heard the sound of the orchestra. The saxophones are sighing in the end of the century, he thought, and began, in the midst of his aimless running, to compose verses, which for a moment seemed to him to be remarkable. At a street crossing, just as he was about to cross the dam, the red light went on. This just suited him. He rushed swaying across between loudly hooting cars, but the next moment he was disgusted with himself and gave up looking for imaginary dangers. He was surprised at his own theatricality, running like a drunken man, exaggerating his movements, as though he wanted to make it clear to the whole world that here was a man running with the burden of a great sorrow. If, he thought to himself, it is a question of responsibility, I must not look for Helene. I must let everything go on to the end, be cold, force things on, and then bear the consequences. But equally strong was the thought that he would escape the consequences, that he would go on living, without reason, with a wound in his soul, but go on living, that he would be guilty of the most shameful betrayal, a betrayal that could only bear fruit in petty feelings, only be fruitful as the counterpole of his confidence, a useless betrayal. Therefore, all things considered, the cause of a wound in his soul. Then he cursed himself for thinking of himself and not of Helene, but he could not help it. Finally, he gave up thinking about anything at all, and from that moment his mind became quite clear. She can't do this, it came to him. She is a Catholic, and he turned into a street which led to the church. If there is no light in the church, if it is locked, he thought. It was locked. He rattled at the door. Through the high windows shone the faint light of the sanctuary lamp. The only thing left was to go to the studio. He ran, his hands on his breast, his elbows pressed to his sides, through the streets, through the eternal, long, dark alleys. He ran along the streets he had so often walked with Helene, past the dimly lighted street corners, past the waiting taxis, past the shops, all closed now, and the inimical house fronts. He began to look ahead of him. Breathing heavily, he peered forward to see if there was still a light in the hall. There was no light, but the gate was unlocked. He threw his whole weight against the heavy creaking doors. As usual, he was irritated by the plaster representations of the Minstrels' Festival in the Wartburg and the homecoming of Tannhauser in the entrance hall. What am I thinking of? He cursed himself, terrified lest all his excitement had been for nothing, and pushed against the door leading into the courtyard and lifted the latch. This door, too, was open, and with his relief at this was mixed the frightening memory that this door was frequently open. He saw something white in the courtyard. He ran up to it, but halfway there turned back again. It was a piece of paper in the dustbin. He looked up at the rear of the house. All the windows were in darkness. Then he remembered shamefacedly that the studio windows, of course, faced the other side. He went up the stairs, taking 3 steps at a time, opening his coat in order to go more quickly. Stairs, stairs, stairs. At every door, on every landing, a fresh odor met him. The dark hole beside the banisters, the deep abyss of the entrance hall had a stupefying odor as he panted upwards. Was there a light in the studio? There was a light. He bumped against the door. He thrust his shoulder against it. "Open the door!" he cried. "It is I, Ive, quick," and fell back, listening. He heard nothing. He listened, and in the distance he heard the scraping of a chair, slow footsteps. "Open the door!" he cried, and put his head against the crack to see if he could recognize the footsteps. They were not her footsteps. The painter pulled the door open. The light struck him in the face. "Where's Helene?" he cried in a hoarse voice, and rushed into the room. But Helene was sitting silent and in deep absorption in front of her easel. She had on her white smock, on her head her old red cap, and her hand was gently moving as she placed her brush on the canvas. "The Dualvahor, den antique Seventa." Ive was himself astonished to find how one small event was capable of diverting him from one line of action to another. This one movement of the spiritual lever was sufficient to shift the points. It is true that his personal collision with the complications of reality had by no means led to personal consequences. If Ive had had any psychoanalytical training, he might have found it possible to have been actually offended with Helene for not committing suicide. He might have been able to dissociate himself from her, not indeed because he was wounded, but for his own peace of mind, and to leave her, with regretful sympathy, to her own fate. Or again, if this kind of spiritual hygiene did not suit him, another course was open to him. He might have frankly admitted his mistake, and have immediately devoted himself to the benevolent service of humanity, beginning with his nearest friends, and thus have entered into the peace of a noble attitude. Unfortunately, Ive was not disposed to acquire the necessary knowledge of the psychical mechanism. Not that he would have been daunted by any kind of mechanism, but he attributed very little importance to these things. He was, for instance, happy in the assurance that nobody could excel him in the use of so complicated an apparatus as that presented by a machine gun. Moreover, he regarded the aforesaid machine gun as undoubtedly the most suitable means of dealing in the most economical way with a number of problems of the times, including so-called intellectual problems. But he was not interested in the problems of the times, but in the times themselves, if one may say so. He was interested in the substructure of power, for which the times were struggling. And his ridiculous adventure in the ballroom and later in the studio had narrowed down for him the field of interest. Narrowed down, that was it. "What have I learned from the town?" he said to Schaffer when he went to say goodbye to him. "I have learned nothing from it except my duty. Rather, I should say it has made my duty clearer to me. And after all, that's a great deal. It's a very great deal." "Oh!" And Schaffer was the first to agree with him there. Schaffer was not in the least astonished at Ive's decision to leave the town. "That's certainly the best thing you can do," he said thoughtfully, and from what he went on to say it was clear how well he realized what was impelling Ive, and others besides Ive. "Everything is a preparation," said Schaffer with precision, and sighed gently, for he could have wished that the preparation was somewhat pleasanter in his own case. How else can the Reich be founded, they both thought, except by 60 million spiritual fortresses? But for Ive the process of fortifying his soul had been completed at the moment that he felt the impulse to leave the town. Just as this process had begun with the impulse to come to the town. Ive gave no further thought to the matter. He took it for granted. But it would be an exaggeration to say that he took it for granted, because he was under the influence of some mysterious urge, because something stronger than himself was driving him. He might as easily have acted otherwise. He might easily have decided to stay with the farmers. and he saw no urgent reason for returning to them now. Yet on this occasion, as on that, he made his decision. He realized that this was the 0 hour, and he prepared himself to go through with it, although no one, not even he himself, could have reproached him if he had decided to shirk. "The time has come," he said now, as then. "It remains for us to carry out what has for centuries been the recognized task of the chroniclers, without falling into the errors which, for centuries, have been the recognized errors of the chroniclers. Namely, in order to make our narrative plausible, to resort to means which have nothing to do with the events we are narrating. We cannot, for instance, describe a trial for witchcraft and at the same time deny that witches existed, and we cannot drag in by the hair a mother or a grandmother, complex, or any other contribution of general culture to show why I've left the town. For even if Ive was aware of these theories, he obviously made no use of them. And as for general culture, he neither tried to make a virtue of necessity, nor to fill in the gaps in his own education. In the first place, the value of this culture would have had to be proved to him, and it seemed to him that the possessors of this precious gift were particularly unsuited for this task. He was not educated but trained, and moreover, trained as a soldier, and thank God, the traces of this training never left him. This probably explains why it was that he never joined in the noisy chorus of those who with the exception of the National Socialists, who had never made any claim to it, regarded it as a reproach to be lacking in what the bankrupts of a whole century, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Émile Loudois, leaving out of account their different degrees of eminence, have understood by the term intellect. Ive did not join in it because he could never get away from the question cui bono. If he did not join the National Socialists, it was not because he could not discern enough traces of the aforementioned intellect among them. On the contrary, it seemed to him that the wine of the Third Reich savored too much of the cork of the Second. "You have not understood anything," Helene had said to him when he was on the point of taking refuge from a general conclusion in a personal decision, and the outcome of events showed him what she meant by this. Actually, she herself was in the same position as Ive. That is, she no longer had any tolerance for the prescriptions of Karl Marx, based on socialistic quackery. It never occurred to Helene to wish for any personal vocation. She had character enough to coordinate her own demands with those of her times, and since she herself had character enough for this, she could and was obliged to demand the same of her friends. She had justified herself, and she observed with sorrow that Ive was about to renounce any claim to justification. Helene asked him to give an account of himself, and he did so. He discovered that he could say yeses to the town, even a satisfied eyes, almost amounting to a declaration of faith. Ive had come to the town to conquer it, and in his cell in the Moabit prison he had dreamed of new battalions which would conquer the town. But the new battalions, which were formed without his cooperation, only conquered the streets of the town. Ive would not have objected, by a miracle of energy, preparation, and chance, to reaching the responsible position of chief burgomaster, but he was kind enough to admit that even so he would not have been able to accomplish much more than Burgomaster Salomon. Ive was prepared to take from the town anything it had to offer him, but more active conquistadores than he had attempted this in their own sphere, and after a pleasant interlude, which had not lasted so very long, had found themselves landed in a cell of the say Moabit prison. And Ive had gained in the town the only experience the town had to offer him, namely, nothing. "Just that, and that is an astounding achievement," he said to Dr. Schaffer, who, while delighted at Ive's laughing confession, could not suppress a sigh, for he had his work cut out to keep on resolutely and rapidly marking time. "The town has taught me nothing," said Ive, for all his experience had been in himself, and if the town had any influence, it was the influence of pressure. This pressure had shaken his whole being. It seemed to Ive that the real function of the town lay in the fact that it was not in it, but through it, that characteristic sublimation took place, in men, in things, in space, and in time. The town had subjected the whole life of the country to its pressure, and Ive realized his duty at the very moment that the town had shown it to be in the country. Back to the farmers? Asked Schaffer. But I've repudiated the word back. He had set himself the task of worming his way into the inmost core of the town, and in the inmost core he had found the country. He had found the core vegetatively, and he took an animal delight in the realization that he had reached exactly the same point that he had left when he set out to find it. Exactly the same duty confronted him, only it was more definite. And he recalled that moment in the editorial office of his farmer's paper when he had realized the spiral process to which every life is subject. The town was life, and he was life, and nothing existed in the world that was not life. Every opinion might give rise to 10 new opinions, each one exceptional and completely authoritative, but in their oscillations, all things tended to meet. All analogues were living. Every thought reacted in all directions. The best formulation was always the first, and at the same time, the first was the last. For there is no validity that is not derived from ultimate validity. If you thought in terms of epoch, it could not matter in the least. It was even essential, had a deep spiritual meaning, that, in spite of everything, there were 6 million unemployed, that Helen put on a sleeveless dress when she went to the newspaper office and crossed her legs when she was talking to Jakobson. Didn't that matter? Was that even essential? Had that a deeper meaning? Were those validities that were derived from an ultimate validity? Didn't it matter that 6 million were slowly rotting and decaying? That they were piled one on top of another like lice in a blanket? That they bit and beat each other, scorned and slandered one another? That they cringed and betrayed and did the dirty on one another? That they trampled each other, up and down, and right and left, because each one wanted to snatch the scrap of dry bread from his neighbor's mouth, and to deprive his tired bottom of its tiny resting place. And yet they were surrounded by plenty. Was it even essential that the farm should be rattling in a death struggle, the wheat withering in the treasury, office flourishing, that the farmer should be done for and that property should be rehabilitated? And when it was not rehabilitated, it should be turned into small holdings, while the small holders could neither live nor die. Poor wretches! And Klausheim was squatting in jail. Was there a deeper meaning in the fact that the painter slapped his paint onto the canvas in mad despair, and Helene rushed off to dance with Jakobson, and he rubbed his belly against her belly, and bought the picture and sold it, and the painter had an amazing and extraordinary bit of luck as well, that they were marching along all the high roads, young men with brown faces and broad hands, and their hands were open and empty, strength thrown away for nothing, seed sown for nothing, blood flowing away for nothing. And in the cinema, they showed society learning to dance. That some talked of the crisis in emergency regulations, and the curtailing of the powers of the Reichsbank, and others talked of nothing. They waited for the stones to speak, but the stones, too, were silent. That all this should be going on. Empty streets and dark desires, the press frothing at the mouth, saxophones shrieking, some being subsidized and others without a tram fare in their pockets. Yes, little man, what now? The Reich buys up bankrupt Gelsenkirchener bonds, not with machine gun bullets, but with 90% profit, and the town takes a deep breath. Symphony of work. Symphony of the Labor Bureau. A red glow in the sky over the Memorial Church. Cars massed in the Augusta. Victoria. Platz. Heaven and hell in illuminated advertisements. Hinnerk calling fresh. Baked rolls. Empty promises. Encouragements. disappointments, joy following fear, ecstasy following despair. Well, little man, how'd you like it? Not a bit of it. 10,000 go to hear Hitler in the sport palace. 10,000 go to hear Thalmann in the sport palace. 10,000 go to hear Loeb in the sport palace. 10,000 watch the 6-day races in the sport palace. The horsemen of the apocalypse gallop through the town. Hunger, lies, and treachery. They cackle in Geneva. They cackle in Lausanne. They cackle in the Reichstag. You too have cackled. But Klausheim did not cackle. The farmers vote for Nazis. And the proletariat votes for communists. It's the only way they can vote. And the only thing they can do is to vote. Wages are reduced. The enemy is reduced. You yourself are reduced. How can I manage with 150 a month? How can I manage with 100 a month? How can I manage with 50 a month? How can I manage with nothing? It just goes on. They cackle in the Landtag, they cackle in drawing rooms, they cackle on payday. You too have cackled, Schaffer, and you have cackled, Hellwig, and you have cackled, Paragot. It began with the failure of the Vienna Credit Bank. It began with the stabbing. It began with the World War. It began with the dismissal of Bismarck. It began with the French Revolution. It began with the Reformation. It began with Adam and Eve. When, by all the powers of heaven and hell, is it going to end? Give us back our colonies. We can't pay and we won't pay. The corridor is a disgrace to civilization. Annexation is forbidden. The Russian 5-year plan. The American repudiation of debts. Events in Manchuria. Memel has given itself to Lithuania. And your wife, brother, will give herself to anyone with money. But Broderman is still there to preserve peace and order. For, thinking in terms of epochs, all validities are derived from one validity. Well then, it is a validity that here and there a man should stand up, that you should stand up, that everyone should stand up and say, Finis, and say, here now and with me a new epoch is beginning, and set to work where he feels the need is greatest, and knows what he has to do. What has I to do? What I did before I came to the town, Schaffer, just that, and with the new knowledge of how necessary it is. Is it the town that taught me that? It was the town that confirmed that. For the town which has to be, showed what must not be. I'll be here. And he realized with gratitude how and why he had lived in the town. And if it was an infinitely tangled and confused web through which he had worked his way, searching and questioning and thinking and talking until he reached the few simple and clear certainties. From these certainties he saw again an infinitely tangled and confused web that he, by his actions, had to create. Set to work, he said, and made a movement with his two hands as though he were lifting a plow from the furrow, although he had no intention of working on the land when he went to the farmers. Ive was not a farmer. Ive was a soldier, not a militiaman engaged for 12 years, of strictly neutral politics, and provided with a ration ticket, not a storm trooper, with black tab on his coat and a two-colored cord on the edge of his collar, presenting colors, and fighting with the communists, in brown trousers which are stripped off in the police station, but a soldier in the small, scattered, anonymous, ever-ready army of the revolution. Was this really so? Certainly, and here we are not making the revolution, we are the revolution. Is there never, then, to be peace and quiet in our poor beloved fatherland? No, by God, there shall not be peace and quiet in our poor beloved fatherland. Is then brute force? Aye. Exactly, and those who wield it must not succumb to it. Then is the terror, is chaos. Ones are dull. Precisely, and those who exercise the terror and create chaos must not have it within themselves. Does the nation want this? Nobody knows what the nation wants, or what she will want, but we want the nation. And who are we? We are those who want nothing but the nation, who wanted nothing else in the trenches, or among the workers, or with the farmers, wanted nothing else but the nation on the wide stretches of the marsh, and wanted nothing else in the confusion of the town. We are those who recognize no law and no obligations but the law and obligations of the nation, the will of the people. We are our own will towards the right. We are those who are ready to do away with enticement and temptation, with the whole mess of position and consequence and promotion, the whole slime of craft and humiliation, and of filth hidden behind high phrases about duty and responsibility. All the rotten talk of live and let live. Do the people want it? No one knows what the people want. The people themselves do not know what they want, but it is what we want. And if what is to come proves to be bitterer than 4 years of war and 15 years of the consequences of war, all honor to us that we have been prepared to face it. And if it should prove to be not bitterer, then once more honor to us that we have been prepared to face it. To hell with the past. Now we are no longer brandishing programs. Now we have no quack cures for sale. But wherever there is strength, we will add our strength to it. And where there is none, we will take away even that there is. The farmers still have strength and the workers still have strength, for the former have everything to lose that is worthwhile, and the latter have nothing to lose that is worthwhile. But we have nothing to lose but our faith in the Reich, and nothing to gain but the nation. And if we are called, it lies with us whether we are chosen also. We live in a period of decisions, of movements, which give rise to new decisions every moment. The Reich is as open as a field, ready to receive every seed. And it is for us to see that Satan does not come and sow tares and thistles. It is for us to see that every decision is directed towards the Reich. Whatever the world gives to the Reich, it will transform and give back to the world. Not that its influence reaches to every corner of the earth and is of importance, but that every influence finds in us its purifying meaning, and we have the will to act within it. This means that we are passing from the sphere of protest into the sphere of construction. Every form of protest, whatever disguise it may assume, be it ballot, paper, or a pair of brown trousers, exists outside the actual region of decision. The highest duty of every system can only be to accumulate temporal phenomena, and not to provide a valid objective point. The danger of this lies in the fact that, through systems, a movement that is not yet defined is transformed into a state of affairs that is not yet equal to its task. If the Reich is eternal in its power, then history represents the mutation of its forms, and our task today is to seek the form which corresponds best to its intrinsic character. That National Socialism is as little able to provide this form as any other system based on out of date or mistaken principles has been proved by the course of its development. The essential thing is to reckon up not the possibilities it has left open, but those it has shut off. No doubt, National Socialism has fulfilled a historical mission. It has led the democracy ad absurdum. No doubt, too, with the fulfillment of this mission, its power is no longer justified. The positive of the revolution has not yet been established, which means that the German Revolution has not yet been established. Do not let us fail to realize that insofar as it is aiming at new forms, its elements are to be found in the bourgeoisie. With us, as with the rest of the world, the important thing is to break the supremacy of the bourgeoisie. With us, even more than with the rest of the world, it is plain that the supremacy of the bourgeoisie, in the form it has assumed, is not German, but Western. so that the revolution against the bourgeoisie is a German revolution. And this being so, the most urgent task is the abolition of a state of affairs that has become intolerable, since it no longer even rouses the fertile strength of opposition. And because when the moment comes that we are imbued with the necessity of action, it can only be the German Revolution for which we should work. The task lies in the hands of the revolutionaries, and in no one else's. In the hands of those who have already perfected the revolution in themselves, and not before. For what is the good of being armed to the teeth, if we are not armed to the heart? Indeed, it does not matter from what point the advance is made, provided it is not situated in a vacuum. The masses have no impetus in themselves, and when, in the consciousness of their position, they decide to organize a revolution, they organize a bureaucracy. It is the few that give them the strength they lack. For these, the important thing is not to have a point of view, but to be in a strong position, and each one of them must seek the field of action that is ready to support him, and from which he can act. For me, it is with the farmers, said Ive, as I have found before. He continued, the Reich will not be the farmer's country, but by its daily demands the country transforms the mystic consciousness into a reality. And it is this reality that constitutes society. The farming community contains the only natural form of organized society, and therefore, so long as we are seeking these forms, it must be a stimulus and a pattern. I know what you are going to say, Schaffer, said Ive, but economic planning alone is not enough, although there is certainly no harm in it, and vital interests do not exist except in the brains of the syndics. We have not yet been cheated out of that which gives a meaning to life, and we are not disposed to let ourselves be cheated out of it as we have been cheated out of everything else we can be cheated out of. The important thing remains and cannot be argued about, and it is well for us that it cannot be argued about, for our fate does not lie in round table conferences, nor in the Workers' Committee of the Reichstag, nor in the governing board of the General Electrical Company, but in our own breasts, in the breasts of men who not only know what they want, but know how to accomplish it. You want to know what there is to do, for you and for me. You can't see the forest of flags for the flags. Shall I fetch the system and scheme of a Reich out of my dispatch case? Shall I sketch you a plan straight away, here on the corner of Joachimsthaler and Kurfürstendamm, beginning with the farm, and through community of distress to the province? Beginning with the association through the League to the Board of Agriculture? Beginning with the farmer's current account through the accumulations of financial establishments to the state budget? From the economic calculation of trade through the authority of political economy and to the, so to speak, centralized federalization of economy, of countries and of associations? Shall I enumerate to you the articles of the Constitution, describe the structure of the state organization, the nature of tariff agreements, of monopolies, of financial policy, of budgetary measures, of reciprocal credits? You know that it is not necessary to do that now, but that it is necessary to remove all obstacles and difficulties inherent in the structure of economy and society, and which obstruct any planned economy, and that it is necessary to do that as soon as possible, that it is necessary to go from man to man, and from farm to farm, and prepare them to serve the nation, and to make them proof against the tales of hundreds and thousands of time servers, that it is necessary for us who are armed to the heart to arm ourselves to the teeth. I am going to the farmers, Schaffer, not because I long for the fresh air of the marsh, but because I know that the greatest strength of the country is to be found in famine, because I know that this is the only strength that can be mobilized now and at once, and that the dunderheads are coming from every direction, with it all worked out in millions of rustling documents, to open the dams carefully and set the idle mills running again, because I know that the town is a function of the country and not its chief shareholder, because I know that if the farmer does not rise up in the country at once, the day will come when we shall not be able to rise up and march together for the sake of the right, but will be battering each other's heads for a scrap of land, for a tiny corner of the poor, exhausted, despised soil of the farmers. When you need 18. The commissionaire of the Khedive untied the last dog from the railing, a miserable little breathing atom with a wrinkled face and weak legs, and handed him obsequiously to the lady from the grand car. "Get out of the way there," he said to Hinnerk, who was standing straddle-legged over his basket right in front of the door of the car. "Shut your mouth," said Hinnerk, and the two glared at each other. The commissionaire touched his cap, pocketed his tip, and turned his back haughtily on Hinnerk to close the doors. "Fresh baked rolls," cried Hinnerk, looking right and left, his basket of hygienically wrapped bread on his arm. The basket was still half full. The big lamp in the entrance of the block of offices went out. The employees came out. "Fresh baked. Off you go, my girl, to the underground. Fresh baked. Tuppence, sir? Fresh. There's that fellow over there again." Ah! The fellow was there again, a young man like Hinnerk, in a white apron, cap pulled over his eyes, and a basket of rolls. "Get out away there," said Hinnerk. "This is my corner. Clear out with all your truck." "What am I to do then?" said the other, the comrade over there. "Never mind that," said Hinnerk. "This is my corner. Off you go." But the other fellow did not go, and Hinnerk put his rolls in the basket and went over to arrange matters. "Look out, police," said a voice behind him. "What do I care about police?" said Hinnerk, turning round. "Oh, it's you, Ive." "Yes," said Ive. "Leave him alone. Since when have you adopted capitalist methods?" "You don't understand," said Hinnerk. "There must be order, otherwise we might as well pack up." "Leave him alone," said Ive. "Listen, Hinnerk," he continued, laying his hand on his friend's arm. "I've something to tell you." "What have you to tell me?" asked Hinnerk, but Ive only smiled. For a moment they looked at each other seriously. "There must be order," said Ive at last. "That is probably what Warder Saefenstiebel says when he goes to Claus Heim's cell, and tells him to clean out his pail with sand." "My word," said Hinnerk. "My word," and suddenly he understood, gave Ive a mighty clap on the shoulder, and said again, "My word, really?" Ive nodded. Hinnerk took up his basket and put it down again, and pushed his cap onto the back of his head. "Really?" he said. "Only think, and I actually believed that it would never happen." He was in his element now, and seized his basket and swung it up under his arm. "Tell us all about it," he said, digging Ive in the ribs. "My word, it's taken you 2 years to think it over? 2 years to get to it? My word." "Well, we'll forgive and forget. Tell us all about it," he said. "Tell us all about it," he said. They ambled along the street and across the square. From time to time Hinnerk set his basket down as though it were too heavy for him. But he did it absent-mindedly, for Hinnerk was in his element. "When? Where? How?" he asked. "I'm delighted, my word. I'm delighted. Do you know they're doing a lot of cackling again about an amnesty and so on, and it seems as though Hellwig has really got things going. But I've never really liked it as much as I did when you used to go about the country polishing the Bumbles' doorknobs for them. And I always used to think, I'll do it alone. But you used to say, he won't, and I thought you knew best, and you thought the time hadn't come. And then I got anxious about you, for you were, I thought Ive is so busy swimming with the stream. Don't be annoyed, for you were busy swimming with the stream. Never mind, you're going to get to work now." "Don't forget," said Ive, "that the party repudiates individual terrorism." "What do I care about the party?" said Hinnerk. "What do I care about any party? That was all nothing. Communists or Nazis, a crew. Some of them are dirty dogs and the others are official. Now they are talking about a ban on uniform. A ban on uniforms, my word, as though that had anything to do with it. And even if they do manage to get an amnesty, it's always stuck in my gullet a bit, for really it's damn sauce that an amnesty should be necessary at all. Anybody can pull off an amnesty, but to get them out, not everyone can do that. Ah! A girl came round the corner. I'm delighted, said Hinner. Give me one, said the girl. She was very thin, very much painted, and wore high, red-laced boots up to the knee. There, said Hinnerk, taking 2 handfuls out of his basket. I'm delighted, girl, I'm delighted, off you go. And he said, but this is only the beginning, Ive. Yes, it is only the beginning, said Ive. Oh, of course, said Hinnerk, and I know someone we can take with us. I know a fellow who's been in the cells and knows the lie of the land. No, he's all right. Manslaughter over a girl. What do you imagine? He couldn't come with us otherwise. We might get nabbed or something. And we couldn't do that to Klausheim. Klausheim. He's the only one of us who's really stuck to his guns. We shall need a car. Have you got a car? Never mind. I'll nab one if necessary. Do you think I couldn't? He asked excitedly, and put his basket down. I'll show you now that I can. Wait a bit. There's one over there in Opal. I'm a y'all. Don't, said Ive, catching hold of his sleeve. There's plenty of time for that. There isn't plenty of time, said Hinnerk, walking unhappily beside Ive. Soup isn't good when it's cold. This morning when I woke up I thought, it's high time now that we set to work again, and I thought there's no relying on Ive anymore. They've got him well in tow. He's joined the Lickspittles. Next thing he'll be going to the south of France, or the Riviera, and I thought if he sews the button on his coat, then that's the last straw. Have you? No, the button on Ive's coat was still dangling. Anyway, we are getting to work now, said Hinner. The farmers have been swimming with the stream a bit too. Those were the times, eh, Ive, at the beginning. I used to think, we shall never have times like this again. Well, and now? Of course, it won't be easy to get going again. Now? No, said Ive, it won't be easy, but what we haven't done, time has done. Yes, said Hinnerk, the time is ripe to set to work everywhere, but it's still worthwhile with the farmers. In the country things grow out of dung, but here it only stinks a bit. What's up over there? Something was up over there. Suddenly people were walking more quickly. They were pushing their way in from the side streets. In the shadows, at the corners, in doorways they were standing. There was a commotion in the side streets. Whistles sounded along the fronts of the houses. Isolated shrieks were heard, as though one were calling out courage to the other. Hinnerk stood still and listened. Communists, he said casually. Come on. They went on. You know, said Hinnerk, we must talk this all over at once. I can get away from here any time. There's nothing to keep me here, and if there were, it could whistle. A flying squad car dashed round the corner, and then another, and yet another, and yet another. Hello, said Hinnerk. But that's how things are, he went on. If I have learnt anything here, it is that it's up to us. Up to you and me above all. For the others can't do anything. They are tied. They have let themselves be tied. They are clinging to all sorts of things, particularly to their fancy that it had to be, and that there was no escape for them. They are hanging, like flies on a flypaper. Let them hang. It's up to us who aren't hanging. Who else can it be up to if not to us? Odd, said I. What's odd? Asked Hinnerk. Oh, nothing, said Ive. Only somebody else said exactly the same thing to me. That's not at all odd, said Hinnerk. That's how things are, and we should be scoundrels if we didn't act accordingly. Hello, look at the crowds, over there. Look at the crowds over there. There's a fine bunch of policemen beginning to run all of a sudden. A shot sounds, very faintly, a pistol shot probably, and Hinnerk and Ive are on the spot. The communists are howling and shrieking. Come on, says Hinnerk. The first thing we've got to do is to thrash out a plan. Yes, says Ive, looking at the dark masses and wondering what is happening. He walks more slowly. There's Schweinbach, says Hinner casually. There must be something up. Broderman, asks Ive and stops. Then I must. He peers along the street. Nothing. Come home, says Hinner. Leave me alone, says Ive. Broderman, I must see this. All right, says Hinner, and they wait. Everything is in uproar now. The police sweep round in a broad, dense swarm. A shot, and another shot. Shattering window panes. Shrieks and whistles, one after the other. Keep back. Hey. Move on. Run. Just ball. The rubber truncheons are whirling. Carbines fly down from their shoulders. Barricades have been set up. Just look at them, says Hinner. Look how small they are. What's the good of them? They won't stop anyone. Oh no, against the flying squad. Come on, he says, and then more urgently, come on. Leave me alone, says I. Heavens, how they're hitting out, and we stand here and look on. It won't do, Hinner. It won't do. It won't do. All right, says Hinner. Then I'll just stow my rolls away. Here, in this doorway. But what does it matter about the old rolls now, anyway? He flings the basket into a corner, giving it a kick as it rolls over, pushing the contents on one side with his foot. People rush past, young boys with distorted faces, shakos gleam, gaiters flash by. In raging fury the young men blunder on. But there's no escape. The wall of police is approaching. And there is Broderman. He too has a rubber truncheon in his hand. The wall of disciplined, trained, muscular bodies in trim uniforms moves like a machine. Here and there the line breaks slightly, and closes up again immediately. And Broderman is there. Ive sees no one but him. He hears no one but him. He does not know what Hinner is doing. He does not notice the fighting. He does not hear the shrieks and whistles and shots. Someone jostles him. He sways for a moment and then regains his balance, his legs widespread. Get out, says Broderman in a loud voice. Ive is silent and does not stir. Broderman stands in front of him. Broderman recognizes him. Broderman says, Get out. Ive looks into his face. There are the sagging cheeks, the clean-shaven chin. There's the silver-braided collar and the star on his shako, the straight, severe nose and the ice-cold eyes. Get out, says Broderman, sharp and tense. Clear out of it. Get out. And Broderman raises his rubber truncheon. He raises it high above his head, and Ive sees the muscles in his wide face contract. Then Ive lets out and brings his clenched fist with full force crashing up on his chin and nose. 19. Broderman telephoned at once from the police station to Schaffer. But Schaffer had an important engagement and could not get away. He managed, however, to get into touch with Paragot. Paragot came immediately. As he entered the room, he saw at once the body stretched out on the floor. But the head was covered with a cloth. Broderman was very pale. He stood beside the body, and it seemed to Paragot as though he were trembling, just a little. And on his cheek, above his silver-braided collar, there were still traces of blood. How senseless it all is, he said to Paragot. How senseless it all is. But Paragot did not agree with him. So he said nothing, and as soon as everything that was necessary had been done, he left the room without a word to Broderman. In the ante-room some police officers were standing round, and one of them was telling his comrades all about it. So then I got out my gun, he said, and added, and he stood there. And an East Prussian farmer's son himself, he said. He stood there like a farmer, like a goddamn farmer. Where now? Announcement in the Berliner Tageblatt. We understand that the young man who was killed on the occasion of the disturbances in the Kleiststrasse was the well-known agitator, Hans K. A. Iverson, formerly a right radical, and concerned in the struggle of the farmers. In the famous bomb trial in Altona, he was acquitted in spite of the more than remarkable part he had played. Afterwards, Iverson appears to have adopted democratic opinion. He was even said to have been converted to Catholicism, but To everyone's amazement, he finally espoused the communist cause. He was the ringleader in the encounter of the communist demonstrators with the police, and, since he assaulted a police officer in the exercise of emergency defensive measures, he received a fatal shot. Yo! The end of a political romantic.